Joel. I'm a longtime listener of your channel, and I heard a story on a video a few months ago about a dead guy in a werewolf costume, and it reminded me of a creepy story of my own. I'm a bit of a slow writer, so it's taken forever to write it in, but here it is. Me and the boys were on a road trip from Scotland down to London for my pal's wee brother's stag do. Not a fan of the city, honestly. It's, well, London, and hang around Dawson or Camden for a few days as a tourist, and you'll know exactly what I mean. And so normally I wouldn't be caught dead on a road trip down to that crap hole of a place, but all Jim's wee brother's Barry was getting married like, and for some cursed reason he'd asked Jim to be his best man and to bring his mates for the stag do. And it was kind of sad, actually. I found out later that Barry had moved down to London for his career, but hadn't really met anyone that he'd called a good friend. And his side of the wedding was looking as empty as a nun's body count. So us, being good boys, all piled into Jim's Vauxhall and made the trip from near Glasgow down to Kensington. Now, fun fact, did you know that there's a bar in Kensington that at least at one time was called the Cockpit? Unsure if it was one of those types of bars, but we tried to persuade Jim to make a stop there on our pub crawl, but he was having none of it. Now anyway, I'm rambling away like a twat, and the story isn't about the stag do, which went on like a charm. And same can't be said for the wedding. Effing Barry got cold feet at the last minute and called everything off, and he wasn't the flavor of the month for a while. Now this story is about the road trip. On the way there, before all the will they, won't they, no they bloody won't drama kicked off, I remember we were on some kind of back road just into England, but not the motorway. But there's no shiting way that I can tell the exact road and the exact junction with the precise detail that some of these lads who write into you can remember. It blows my mind, that does. Now what I do remember, though, was the hairy-fanged hitchhiker standing on the side of the road, holding up a sign that read, "Need to get to the werewolves of London. Will pay for petrol." Now me and the lads had a proper laugh at this, and it was May, so this lad wasn't on his way to a Halloween party or anything. It looked like he was just using the Werewolves of London song as a sort of joke to try and actually get someone to stop and give him a ride for the lulls. Now, I was driving at this point, and I decided screw it. It'd make for a mad story to tell at Barry's wedding, so about 300 yards past the guy, I decided to pull in and ask the others if they were all good with bringing this comedy hitchhiker along with us. Hell, he seemed like a good laugh. Maybe he could tag along to the stag do in full costume. Old Ewan fretted the F about it like he always does. What if the guy's a serial killer? He's dressed like a werewolf. That's so unsettling. And I said that there were 4 of us and one of him, and no actual hitchhiking serial killer dresses like a movie monster to lure in his victims. And it seemed to me like giving this lad a ride was just about the safest thing we could do, except for leaving him to just eat our dust. Now Jim and Andy were both up for it, so the arseholes voted that since it was my idea, I'd be the one to trudge back and offer him a lift. When I got out and shone a torch towards it, I was kind of surprised to discover that he hadn't started heading towards the car. Maybe he hadn't noticed us pulling in. The sun had set by now, and he probably had limited vision with that stupid party werewolf mask he had on. And so I shut the torch off and decided that I was going to have a little fun of my own. This guy was clearly down for some spooky shenanigans, trying to hitchhike as a werewolf, so I figured I'd sneak up on him and try to give him a scare before offering him the ride he'd obviously be grateful for. And so I snuck over the barrier onto the grass verge and snuck towards this weirdo hitchhiker. But before I did, I saw another car pull right beside the fellow, and the car's headlights were on and the hitchhiker had been standing under a street lamp, and so I had a good look at what was going on. A lad my age was driving, and it looked like he had a passenger around our age too. I saw him lean out and talk to the werewolf hitchhiker, and it looked like they were exchanging some good-natured banter. It seemed like the fellow was about to get his ride and we'd have to head off our way. And then I froze. From the bracken lining the road, 3 figures dressed in black, wearing balaclavas, snuck around the back of the car. One of them yanked the passenger out and tossed him onto the verge, and then started kicking him ferociously. Another one of the black-clad men kind of got the first guy to settle down, then they must have restrained or tied the passenger up or something, and sort of marched him off the road and onto the grass, so he wasn't in any danger of getting hit, I guess. Now, meanwhile, the other black-clad figure was having a tough old time with the driver trying to drag him out of the vehicle, and then the werewolf hitchhiker pulled out what looked to be a pistol and aimed it at the driver. Cue another beating, another tying up, and the driver being thrown into the grass siding to join his mate. The werewolf ripped his mask off, and I got a bit of a look at his face, and he had one of those sort of lip scars. You know, the ones that you get from corrective surgery as a wean, and I guess he didn't think any witnesses were around to catch his face. Suddenly, I was bricking it, because I realized that they were going to drive right past our idling car, and God knows what they'd do if they thought that we were witnesses. And imagine my relief when the carjackers gunned the engine and did a 180 on that empty road and then shot off in the opposite direction. I ran to check on the driver and his passenger. They were bruised and the passenger had been seemingly knocked unconscious, but the driver was just about awake. He gave the same story we'd had. This guy dressed as some comedy cartoon werewolf was clearly not going to be some threat, and it was actually a pretty clever way to put people at ease. I realized it worked the opposite way too. We'd all just been too adamant that this guy was safe that we didn't even consider some ploy. I managed to get some phone reception and immediately called the police. And then I called Jim back at the car and told him what had happened, and cue the lads all calling me variants of the C word as if this was my fault. Long story short, the cops told us that this was the third instance nearby of someone dressed as some furry hitchhiker using this comedy value to kick off a carjacking. The first two cars had been found burned a few miles away. No idea what the purpose was, and the same thing ended up happening with this latest car I found. I kept in touch with the driver, invited them to the stag do too, but they weren't really feeling up for it, obviously. We made it to the hotel at like 9 in the morning and with one hell of a story to tell Barry. He seemed kind of distracted, even when the drinks were flowing and we were partying hard late that night, but obviously that was the old cold feet. Can't blame him for not being blown away by our story when he was planning on ditching his bride at the altar. I still think that was a prick move. Anyway, moral of the story is this: don't pick up any kind of hitchhikers. The harmless ones might just be the most dangerous, and if someone's dressed like a predator, maybe believe them. I see it all over the internet. Those stupid YouTube thumbnails of Dog Man, which definitely isn't just a werewolf given a name so he becomes some creepypasta. All those stories on the Chans and the Reddits and the pastas, you know the ones. Probably one of the most overused cryptids in my opinion because he's only supposedly to be found in Michigan, although people apparently see him all over and apparently people love him. Now I wonder how they'd feel if they knew that there is a dog man out there, or at least there was, and he's no cryptid. He called himself Dogman, and he's very human, and he's more dangerous than any made-up creepypasta monster you could think of because he's real, and I know it because I've met him. It was about 7 years ago, and me and the bestie decided to set off on an extended spring-summer road trip from Michigan to Flagstaff, Arizona. We were off to visit our other high school bestie who'd just graduated college in Arizona and moved into her own place. Her boyfriend was on deployment, so she was going to be staying in the new place alone. Now cue our selfless act of going to stay with her on vacation. On the way, one of our overnight stops was a motel in Woodward, Oklahoma. Now sorry for all the place names and all of that, but they're relevant to the Dogman legend, I promise you. And it was a particularly hot month, so we were out sunbathing by the pool until pretty late into the evening, and then there had been a group of kids playing in the pool itself, and they must have ranged from around 8 years old to 12, and maybe made up of a few different groups of travelers who'd stopped at the motel, and one of them we found out later was the son of the motel owners. The kids were mostly ignoring us, playing with the pool noodles and toys, talking about whatever kids that age talked about back in 2019. Now, not quite the skibbity toilet or 6-7 years yet there, but occasionally thought that you could tell that a couple of the older kids were eavesdropping on our conversations, particularly when we talked about our plans of taking a walk into the woods just outside the motel. It seemed like a safe area, and we both felt like a late-night stroll. We've been fairly into camping in our college days, so a quick walk through the undergrowth with flashlights as the midnight hour dawned seemed suitably fun. Now, one of the kids, the motel owner's son, as I found out later and said previously, swam over to the edge of the pool and kind of lurked there for a bit. I could tell he wanted to say something to us, but was just too shy or nervous or hormonal to speak to a couple of sunbathing women. Now, eventually I took pity on him and asked him if he was having a good summer or something like that. The kid perked up at the attention and kind of mumbled that, yeah, he was having a good time. And then he just blurted it out. We shouldn't stay out after the sun had gone down, and we shouldn't go walking in the woods after dark. The sun was already beginning to set, so I asked him why. And over at the other side of the pool, I could see the other kids whispering to each other. They weren't giggling or acting like this was some kind of prank, though. They seemed genuinely serious as they spoke to each other. I asked the kid talking to us why we should be so careful. Was it a rough area? Were there wild animals in the woods, etc.? And the boy looked at me with absolute dead seriousness and said that Dogman was out there. Now, I kind of started laughing a lot about this and then realized that he was looking genuinely hurt and serious. And I told him that Dogman wasn't real. And even if he was, he supposedly lived in Michigan, where we were from. Now, he replied by saying that Dogman is definitely real, and I could ask his parents who ran the motel if I didn't believe him. Obviously, I wasn't going to start asking the motel owners about creepypastas. I'd look like a total weirdo. And instead, I asked the kid if there were any other dangers in the woods or if it was just this Dogman. Now, he said it was just Dogman, and this Dogman kept everything else away. Now, I tried to reassure this kid by telling him that because we were from Michigan, Dogman's home state, we knew how to handle him and he wouldn't hurt us. And the kid looked very skeptical about this, but eventually just shrugged and swam back to his friends. Now, cue a few hours later. It had gotten cold, so we had gone outside, showered, and then changed into some light hiking gear. Both of us kept joking about running into Dogman and about whether there was a werewolf prowling the area. We were maybe 2 weeks away from a full moon, so we figured things were pretty safe, if, werewolves had been even real. Now, we knew there was a picnic spot in the woods for motel guests, so we decided to follow the trail leading there, and then use that as a base of sorts to head into the deeper woods. As we followed the trail, I noticed a sign lit up by the beam of my flashlight, and it read something like, "Picnic area ahead," but then there was a bunch of smaller text underneath. I got closer to read it, and it said something about how the motel owners strongly advise guests to stay on the trail and only use the area during daylight hours. It said that they weren't responsible for any guests who explored the woods after dark, and that the land beyond the picnic area was public land and not maintained by the hotel owners. And so the kid had been right, at least, that his parents advised people not to explore the woods after dark. That was very likely an insurance/safety thing, though. Heck, maybe they told their kid about a Dogman to keep him from getting into danger himself. That probably was the case. And we reached the picnic area, which seemed like it would have been nice in the daytime, making a note of which compass direction we were heading in and pushing forward into the woods in the direction that seemed the most accessible. We'd been walking around 20 minutes, taking in the nature, mostly the occasional owl or other unidentified birds, and it wasn't exactly a pretty forest, at least in the night, and the motel owners had certainly been right in that it wasn't well maintained. My friend kept worrying about twisting her ankle or cutting her leg on the tree branches, so we were discussing about heading back. And that's when we saw movement all around us. An animal. Well, multiple animals running noisily through the forest in the dark, making no effort to disguise their presence. And then we heard a bark, and both looked at each other, clearly thinking the same thing. More barking followed, and from what I could gather and make out, there were 3 dogs running around in the forest just a ways from us. They didn't seem interested in us, but they were certainly interested in something, barking and growling in general. It was hard to tell, and I didn't want to draw too much attention to us, but I did use the flashlight to try and spot the animals, since they would have clearly been able to smell us and attack if they were going to. From what I could tell, they were Rottweiler-type dogs, a couple black and tan ones, and then another that looked to be mostly tan. Now, the main point is, they were all very big dogs. One of them was smaller than the others, which is how I could tell the two black and tan dogs apart, so I took that one for a growing pup. Now, I've been so focused on the dogs that I didn't hear the rustling through the undergrowth or the sounds of footsteps until they were almost on us. And then, a huge man with a filthy coat and an almost glowing white beard burst out of the trees. His face was a mask of fury, at least what I could see of it behind the beard and without shining the flashlight straight into his face. He was holding a huge walking cane, about as tall as he was, with a bulbous wooden knot at the top, which looked like it could do some serious damage. And when the guy spoke, he had an accent that didn't quite sound American and also spoke like he wasn't used to talking much, almost like his vocal cords didn't get much of a workout often. The guy demanded to know what we were doing in his woods, especially two young women, and why we were so comfortable being in danger. I started to splutter some kind of response, which he completely ignored and whistled for the dogs to come to him. The three dogs, confirming my theory of how many there were, came bounding through the undergrowth and settled at their master's side. The biggest one was kind of foaming and drooling at the mouth, as if he'd been on the verge of a catch or a kill, and they sat there obediently, but I could tell that they were wired with energy and desperate to be set free by their owner again. Now, I started to speak again, but one of the dogs growled, almost warning me, and so I quickly fell silent. The old man started croaking at us that we were effing stupid B-words for walking in the woods at night, because wasn't it obvious that something terrible was going to happen to us? And he didn't have time to protect everyone. And besides, his dogs were animals after all. They might mistake us for something else, and then there'd be nothing he could do. Now, I started shaking at this as I saw all three dogs staring at me. Maybe I was imagining it, but it looked like they were staring hungrily now, staring at me specifically too, and not my friend. And then, the old man told us that we needed to leave the way we came immediately, and that he was releasing his dogs to go back to their patrol. If they mistook us for something else, then that was on us. We were already turning to run before we heard the man tell his boys that they were free to go play. And thinking back, I'm not sure if running was actually a good idea. It might have given the dogs more of a reason to follow us. In fact, the youngest one did start chasing after us for a little bit, and to this day I don't know if he meant to do us harm or was just thinking we were playing. And when we reached the picnic area, the dog just stopped, like he knew that he wasn't allowed to cross the boundary into the motel's land. And we didn't stop running though, and it's a miracle neither of us had injured ourselves by the time we sprinted back to our room. And we barely even had the energy to discuss what had happened. We both collapsed into our single beds, half-dressed, and slept until morning. And the next day on checkout, a teenage girl was handling the desk, and we hadn't seen her before. It had been an older man when we checked in who said that he was the owner, and I could see the family resemblance, though, between the owner, this girl, and the kid who'd spoken to us at the pool. Now, I very sheepishly told her that we'd gone walking in the woods and encountered a guy with these very vicious dogs. Now, the girl's face went kind of white, at least how I remembered it, and then she composed herself again. She explained that everyone just called him Dogman, and he patrolled the forest every night with a constantly changing rotation of dogs. Nobody really knew how many dogs he had or where he lived and kept them, but she knew that he had at least 15. And she told me that her dad knew more about the guy, but would never talk about him, and that he'd just drummed it into his kids that they were to absolutely avoid Dogman at all costs and call the cops if he ever came into the motel property. And then she kind of glanced at a photo on the wall, so I went over to examine it. And it was an old army photo, looked to be from maybe the early 2000s, and it was a platoon led by a guy who I could clearly recognize as the motel owners, but quite a bit younger. But it was the guy on the far left who caught my attention. He was staring off into the distance, not looking at the camera like the rest of the unit, and in his hand he held a harness attached to a military dog that sat beside him. One of those dogs that sort of sniffed out minds, I figured. Now, the teenage girl remarked that it was a photo of her dad when he served in the army, just before he was honorably discharged and opened this place. She didn't comment on the man that I'd seen, the bearded soldier who bore more than a striking resemblance to Dogman. And the girl added one final thing. She told me that Dogman allegedly patrolled the forest every night with his army of dogs to prevent an unnatural occurrence. Everyone in the area knew he was unhinged, but they had no idea if or how he was dangerous. No local law enforcement wanted to go searching the deep woods for a man and his army of dogs, and honestly, I can't say that I blame them. And so next time you hear about the Dogman creepypasta, know that, yeah, there probably isn't some werewolf prowling Michigan, but somewhere in Oklahoma, there is a man that they call Dogman, and he's definitely someone to avoid. I'm willing to bet that I'm one of your older listeners at a grand old age of 67, and ever since I could talk, I'd tell my dad to put his rock and roll records on, and my entire family and I knew that music was in my blood. Guitarist, lead singer, hell, even drummer, they were in my future. Instead, I'm a retired accountant, but with how tired I feel these days and how much my joints ache, I'm not sure that the rock and roll life would have been for me. Now, I may not have found superstardom in a band, but I did attend plenty of concerts in my day. Bands who've split up, bands who aren't even alive anymore, some of the live shows I've seen could make you spit with jealousy. And the concert I was attending when this event happened was a show on Kiss's The Alive tour, and I can't even remember where the venue was these days, only that it wasn't the infamous Detroit show. Now, the problem with concerts back then was that I was 17 and still didn't have my license. Now, I was, according to our driver's ed teacher, the biggest liability behind the wheel that he'd ever seen, and I think I'm a bit of a better driver these days. Now, anyway, the point was, I could drive myself cross-country to see these shows, and my friends were into lame crap like Simon and Garfunkel or Bob Dylan. Of course, I realized these people weren't lame crap at all these days, but back then, I was all about the rock, baby. And so nobody wanted to spend 3 or 4 days in a car with me to chauffeur me to a concert they didn't even want to watch. And this meant that my best method of travel was taking the Greyhound bus. However, that cost money, and I was a broke high schooler, so I took the second best option, hitchhiking. I'd hitched a bunch of times when this happened, and everything had gone fine, which is a small miracle when you think about it. But my luck was about to run out when that old beaten-up red Volkswagen camper van pulled up, and I could see a long-haired guy in the driver's seat, and it looked like he was wearing an AC/DC shirt. Sick. And then the door slid open, and I saw the most beautiful girl I'd ever seen in all my life. She was the kind of girl you dream of when you're a 17-year-old boy, and then I saw another guy in the back, and my heart fell. He was obviously her boyfriend. Now, the girl asked where I was headed, and I told her that I was headed to the Kiss concert. It turns out that was exactly where they said they were going, and she said that I was welcome to ride with them as long as I didn't mind putting up with her annoying brothers. So, no boyfriends then, I guess. I didn't mind. I didn't mind at all. I was some 17-year-old kid. Drugs and rock and roll were on my mind pretty much all the time, and that's why I was totally psyched when, as soon as we got back on the road, the girl offered me a joint. I'm going to call her Janice because in my head at the time she reminded me of Janis Joplin. The other two guys can be Peter and Will, younger brother and the driver. Janice was quick to light up and seemed intent on filling the van with as much weed smoke as possible. The windows were closed, so it didn't take long before we were hotboxing ourselves, laughing at the stupidest crap. And I remember talking rock and roll and being a little surprised that the rock trio didn't really have much in the way of opinions when it came to rock music. Now, eventually, the joint had been smoked to within an inch of its life, and that's when I noticed it. The van stank. And I mean, it really stank. I'd never smelled anything like it, and it was suddenly so strong that I can't believe that even the weed masked it. And I'm telling you, it smelled like Sodom and Gomorrah in that vehicle. Not that I know what Sodom and Gomorrah smelled like, but I imagine it was exactly like that. Now, I don't know how to describe it. It was like the rot mixed with death, mixed with lavender, mixed with perfume and incense, and the lingering smell of weed. Throw in Peter's BO, which I suddenly realized was almost intolerable as he moved across the seat to me. And how could these people tolerate this and with the windows closed? I wasn't exactly the most hygienic clean freak. I was a teenage boy with crusty socks tucked under my mattress. And boys, you'll know exactly what I mean by this, but this stench was too much. Suddenly Will looks back, taking his eyes off of the road for an alarming amount of time, and asked Janice and Peter if they thought Daddy was going to be okay. Now okay, they weren't apparently siblings, and I know girls still call their fathers Daddy right into adulthood, but it was weird as heck to hear two grown men talking about Daddy. Peter insisted that this Daddy could look after himself. Janice started lamenting how it might affect Daddy because of the tragic events that happened to someone called Charlie. Now, I tried to insert myself into this conversation here, asking if Charlie was okay and if he was a member of the family. Janice giggled and told me that they didn't know Charlie, but they deeply loved him. The problem was that Daddy felt spiritually free while Charlie was allowed to work, and now he'd been usurped by the man. I got this sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach as I wondered if there was any chance they were talking about Charles Manson, and that Daddy was maybe one of his followers or acolytes who hadn't been caught or identified. Filled with idiotic teenage bravado, I decided to simply ask, acting as if I was some big fan of the murderous cult leader. Now, I had gone through a period where I tried to convince myself his music was good, so I wasn't totally lying. And instead of acknowledging me, Janice made it pretty clear that she didn't want to address the topic when she announced that it was way too hot in the van and how could any of us stand it. I just sat there as a teenage boy in awe as she stripped away her t-shirt, leaving herself completely bare-chested. I was a little taken aback at the cigarette burn scars that I could see on her body, but at least they looked old and healed. Janice made a big show of pretending that she hadn't noticed the effects that she had on me, but I could tell that she enjoyed the reaction because she kept asking me questions to direct my attention towards her and give me an excuse to look. The questions started out innocent enough, like how many girls had I made out with? 3, but I told her 8. Had I been with any of them? Yes, which was true, although it was the most awkward moment of my life for both of us, and to this day I'm not even sure if it really counts as such. And then she asked me if I'd ever hurt anyone. I said that yeah, probably, by accident, but she said no. Had I ever really hurt anyone, like caused serious damage to another person? I said that no, I hadn't. Janice giggled and said neither had she, but that Peter had some stories. Peter, who was about 5'6" and skinny as a rake, didn't exactly look like the dangerous type, but you never know. Janice told me that I should take a look over the back seat to see the gift that they were bringing Daddy. My nose had acclimatized to the smell of Satan's sweaty butthole at this point, but as soon as I leaned over the back seat, it was like being hit with an olfactory WMD. I can't even describe the smell, but I can describe the source. If you're squeamish, maybe stop listening for 30 seconds. In the storage area of the VW was a clear plastic box filled with some kind of animal entrails. Now, the unidentified meat was crawling with maggots, some of which were just starting to emerge as flies. And I studied for as long as I could, trying to determine whether I was looking at a human body. I couldn't see any bones or anything besides rotting chunks of meat, and Janice asked me if she thought Daddy would like it. I had no idea what to say. I didn't want to offend these people and end up in that bucket, and at the same time I was somehow still taking in the sights Janice was offering. She was drawing my attention with her movements and her stretching, and she knew it, trying to put me at ease, I guess. In the end, I told her that I thought Daddy would love it and that it seemed to please everyone because it was met with a round of applause. Now, for half an hour we sat there awkwardly as I avoided asking about Daddy or their rotting cargo, and instead tried to direct the conversation back to music. Now, I soon began to suspect that they weren't attending this Kiss concert at all, and this is what snapped me out of my stupor. I had to get out of here, and there was no way that I was leaping out of a moving vehicle. Thankfully, these three idiots offered me an opportunity. Further up the highway was a gas station. Will announced that we needed gas, and Janice said that she was craving some beef jerky. Without seeming like my heart was about to explode with terror, I told them that I needed to use the bathroom, like really bad, and so they let me out and I ran to the outdoor restroom. I'm not sure what my plan was from there. Sneak out the back window, sneak into the gas station, and tell them that I was hitchhiking with a bunch of loonies carting around rotten meat who might be part of a satanic cult. I shouldn't have worried. From inside the restroom, I heard the sound of tires peeling away and a vehicle speeding off like their lives depended on it. Considering the VW was the only vehicle in the lot when we got there, I had a feeling that I was the one who'd been ditched. Now, sure enough, when I peeked out of the restroom, the VW was gone. My backpack, which I'd left in the camper in case it looked suspicious, had been thrown into the parking lot, its contents sort of thrown all over the ground. And like a dumb kid, my absolute first concern was to check the wad of money I had in my backpack. I was certain they'd robbed me, but no. Not only had they left all of my money, they specifically removed it from its hidden compartment in my backpack, as if to say, we could have stolen this, but we didn't. I went into the gas station and told the attendant, an older, kindly woman, everything, and I asked her advice, and she was a bit baffled. They hadn't technically committed a crime, but with all the cult crap going on following the Manson family's murder spree and capture, it was fairly obvious that they had something bad in mind, or it could have been an incredibly messed up prank on just some poor kid. And that's what the cops thought anyway. I wouldn't give my name during the call, and I don't think this helped my case, but I had a record and I really did not like cops. They told me it was probably just a prank and I should just count myself lucky, and then they hung up. But it still haunts me to this day. Were they some kind of sicko cult members who worship Manson? Who was this daddy figure? And were they just pranking me, screwing with the kid they picked up on the side of the road? In the years that followed my encounter, I kept an eye on the news for any raids on cult compounds. There seemed to be a few, but I have no way of telling if Janice, Will, and Peter were a part of them. So, I'm from Newcastle, born and raised, but I lived down south in Bristol for a few years now. Just after lockdown was lifted, I decided to take a quick road trip back home to see the parents and my old pals. It was the worst decision of my life and led to the scariest, most death-defying moment I've ever experienced. I was driving down the motorway on the way home, like you do, and I was heading towards an overpass, just one of many, and thought absolutely nothing of it. Why would I? You drive under dozens of these heading cross-country across the United Kingdom. And as I passed under the overpass and out the other side, something came smashing down onto the bonnet of my Ford. It took me a second or two to react, dangerously slow even, and then I realized some effing little effer had dropped a breeze block off of the overpass and right onto my car. Now you hear about this happening sometimes. Gangs of teens are just some dumb kids who don't realize that they're likely to kill someone by doing this. You just never expect it to happen to you. Thankfully, the motorway was pretty deserted and I was able to pull onto the hard shoulder. Now the whole time my car was beginning to smoke and cracks were spiderwebbing up through my windscreen. I pulled over, jumped out, and then winced as I realized that I'd left my phone in the car and had to lean back in to get it out. I'd gotten out a meter or so from the vehicle when the windscreen shattered inwards completely, breaking apart into those sort of chunks of glass that the car windscreens do. Now immediately I was on the phone with the coppers straight to 999 and I told them what had happened. My voice was shaking and almost cracking from the fact that I'd nearly bloody died. They talked me through everything, whether it was safe to put on my hazard lights and all that kind of stuff, and then they told me that I was the third person in the area to take a hit from that overpass, but the first to suffer such a risky bullseye. Now, I got kind of mad then and asked why they weren't monitoring the overpass to see who was doing this crap, and bless the lady on the phone, she was so patient with me. She explained that they had been monitoring the overpass, but they didn't have the manpower to keep watch 24/7, and I'd gotten extremely unlucky. And so, to their credit, the cops showed up very quickly, cordoned off the area, and then took me to the police station in the nearest town to give a statement. Now, they even gave me vouchers for a travel lodge and a car rental company because my car had to be taken in for forensic evidence. Now, I asked them what they expected to find from a shattered breeze block, and they said that they had to check anyway. And I got a bit suspicious and pressed the issue on this. Turns out that after cordoning my car off and driving me into town, they'd let it abandoned until the tow vehicle got there. In that time, someone had graffitied a cock along the side of the car, as well as opened the door and rifled through my glove compartment. And so they wanted to take the car into the impound and check it for evidence. Well, this process took months, and by then I managed to finally sort out a new car with my insurance company. And eventually, though, I did hear back from the cops. They'd found a couple of fingerprints. Oh joy, right? Well, the culprits who nearly killed me had been identified, and they were going to get their just desserts. Except they were all under 18, which meant the worst that they could face was a short stint in juvie, and they didn't even get that. I didn't even get to hear about all the details because apparently the culprits were a lot younger than 18, but basically it was decided that they weren't intending to actually hit any cars or hurt anyone by dropping breeze blocks off of a freaking overpass. And so they got a warning on their criminal record, which will be expunged when they turn 18. And I got to enjoy the experience of nearly dying and then having to spend literal hours on the phone to my insurance company trying to get a payout in a new car. Next time I travel home to Newcastle, I'm taking the bloody train. Hey Joel, I got a quick one for you which happened to me and my family last summer. Now, we were off on a road trip for our summer vacation, something we'd always wanted to do as a family and never had. Now, I'd never do it again either for a whole bunch of reasons. Both the kids arguing constantly, me and the wife arguing constantly, the boring fatigue of driving endlessly, all sorts of reasons. But I think the biggest reason I'd skip out on another road trip vacation was Grandpa. We'd stopped at a national park for a picnic. I forget which one now, the whole thing was a bit of a hectic blur, and what I do remember is when we returned to the parking lot, there was a guy sitting in the back seat of my car. The car had been locked, and to this day I have no idea how he got in. He looked like he was maybe in his mid-20s, but he had extremely pale blonde hair, almost white, something I immediately noticed. I pulled open the door and began demanding, what gives? And he starts talking and calling himself Grandpa, telling us to hurry up and get in so we could get a move on. Now, the kids come over because they were curious, and I was trying to gesture to my wife to take them away while also keeping an eye on this Grandpa character. Now, when he saw the kids, he got excited to see them and told them to hurry up and get in beside Grandpa so we could move on to our next stop. Somehow he knew exactly where we were going next, and that kind of unsettled the crap out of me. Meanwhile, the kids were unsettled because their actual grandpa, my father-in-law, had passed away a couple of months before our vacation. So this weird guy calling himself Grandpa, it kind of confused and scared my kids, both of whom were only 4 and 6 at the time. I slammed the door shut on the guy and began trying to get cell reception to call the cops. All the while I kept my eye on this grandpa when suddenly 2 things happened at once. 1, I actually got reception and my call started to go through to 911. 2, Grandpa pulled some kind of box cutter and began slashing at the back seats, freaking out and screaming. The car was mostly soundproof, but I could hear that he was just yelling gibberish, and for some reason slicing up the seats of my car. I got through to the operator and then the cops, and I was trying to explain what had happened, all while panicking because now this guy had some knife. Now, I remotely locked the car by this point, but it wouldn't be too hard for him to figure out how to let himself out. So immediately I'm telling dispatch that this guy has a knife, and she asks if there's anywhere safe my family can go and lock ourselves in while we wait for the cops to arrive. I remember that there's a restroom in the picnic area, so we all head there. Now, the wife takes our 2 kids and locks them in one stall, while I lock myself in the next one. We're in the women's restroom, and I'm praying that some poor girl doesn't come in and hear me frantically talking to the cops from some locked stall. Thankfully, I hadn't seen anyone else around in the area. I stayed on the phone with dispatch for what felt like a half hour, and eventually an officer came into the restroom and called out that we were safe to exit, but to prepare ourselves. And when I got outside, it was chaos. Our luggage had just been thrown around the entire area. The car had gouges from the box cutter all over it, and as I ran towards the vehicle, an officer tried to stop me, but it was too late. I could smell the smell. Grandpa had defecated on the back seat of the car, a lot, and it absolutely reeked in the summer heat. Now, we were driven to the nearest station. When we arrived, we were informed of the good news. They picked up this grandpa character walking down the freeway, and for some reason he was naked from the waist down and completely unable to explain who he was or why he'd done what he'd done, other than that he was Grandpa. And as you can probably guess, it turned out to be drugs, and as far as I know, he's still in a court-mandated rehab program. Now, thankfully, I didn't have to get involved any further. We gave our statements, and that was kind of that. A cop very kindly offered to speak to his cousin, who ran a car rental firm, to make sure that we could continue our road trip vacation. Now, while it was a very generous offer, I think we were all just too unsettled, scared, and exhausted to take him up on it, and so instead we recovered the few belongings we were sure that Grandpa hadn't soiled on and took the Greyhound bus home. And so yeah, that was my fun little road trip story. It kind of keeps me up at night thinking about how much worse things could have been with my kids around, but maybe writing to you all will exorcise that demon. Screw drug abuse, though, and screw road trips. I just wish that I knew how this lunatic had managed to get into our remotely locked, fairly modern vehicle without any kind of damage to the doors or anything. Now, I think not knowing that drives me more mad than anything else, except worrying about what could have happened to my kids. Hopefully this grandpa guy is getting the help he clearly and desperately needs. I have an absolutely weird thing that happened to me a few years ago. So my brother and I live in different states, a day or so apart, and if we're going to hang out, then that means a road trip. That's fine by me. I love cruising the open road, top down, tunes blaring. I would have loved to have been around during that era of epic music. Oh well, I was born in 2002 and I'm 24 currently if you want to feel old. And so the last rest stop that I'd pulled into, I bought one of those huge Slurpees, which was a big mistake. It was starting to play havoc on my bladder a lot sooner than I expected, and I couldn't see a sign for another rest stop coming up soon. I contemplated pulling over and just letting her rip in nature, but it wasn't exactly a deserted road. No, instead I kept driving, holding it in like a champion. Eventually I saw a small rundown gas station on the side of the road with no real signage, and kind of wondered how they ever even got business. I pulled in, didn't even lower my roof, and just flung myself out the door and ran to the restroom, praying that it wasn't one of those old types where you needed to get the key from the owners. Thankfully it wasn't. I double-checked that I was heading into the men's room. These days I'm paranoid about accidentally walking in on some chick and being labeled a predator. Now thankfully I was, so I headed inside, just about peeing my pants, and all the stall doors were mysteriously closed, and I had the suspicion from the state of the place that they just simply locked the stalls up rather than fix or clean them. Now why didn't I use a urinal, you ask? Well, there were 3 and every one of them was smashed in some way, and some big out-of-order signs covered the broken porcelain. Well, anyway, the final stall was open sort of ajar, and I figured that this had to be safe at least, and I thought about leaning down to check under the stall for feet, but A, That would mean lying on some sticky floor covered in God knows what, and B, imagine if someone had caught me doing that. Now instead, I just coincidentally pushed the door open, certain that everything would be fine. It was not fine. There was a woman standing on the closed toilet, and she was, to put it mildly, extremely morbidly obese. I could see her body pressing against the stall walls, and I was honestly surprised that she managed to get into the stall, let alone climb up into the toilet. She had some brown hair and no makeup, and she was wearing one of those moo-moo things for larger people. Now, confession, I used to be a complete fat ass myself, and I've only begun my gym journey recently, but I'm doing well, I think. And she was staring over my head like she was looking at herself in the bathroom mirror. I looked behind me and saw that the mirror was broken and barely there, so I'm not sure if she was even able to see herself. I called out to her. I couldn't think of what the hell to say to a woman standing on a toilet, so I just sort of said, "Excuse me, ma'am. This is the men's room. The women facilities are next door." And then she looked down at me like she'd noticed me for the first time. Her face was completely expressionless as she stared at me like she was looking straight through me. And despite the comical nature of this situation, there was something intensely creepy about this extremely large woman crammed into a toilet stall, standing on the toilet, looking down at me like she'd never seen a human being before. Now, I had absolutely no idea what to do. The way she was staring at me made me feel like some specimen or potentially a victim. Should I try and help her? Did she even need help? In the end, I decided to say screw it and pulled the stall door shut so I couldn't feel her eyes on me. And then, I'm ashamed to say, my own bladder situation was so bad that I allowed myself to pee in the sink. I kept one eye on the entrance, but if the creepy staring woman caught me, then that was her own fault for being a weird bathroom lurker. And I went into the gas station to tell the owners everything. Well, everything apart from the peeing in the sink aspect. The guy working the register was a bored-looking kid around my age, and I had to repeat myself 3 times before I realized that he had earbuds in. I waved in his face to get his attention, which seemed to annoy him. I told him about the woman in the bathroom and how it had all played out. He sighed and rolled his eyes and said that he was sick of us playing the same prank, so me and my buddies should just knock it off. I tried to explain I wasn't even from the area and it wasn't a prank, and if he'd just go look, he could see for himself. He pointed out that this would leave the store completely unattended, and I told him I'd come with him. Now he countered with the fact that I could have accomplices. I told him to lock up, and in the end he got pretty angry and told me that he wasn't just going to do anything at all about this made-up nonsense. I glanced out the window, frustrated as hell. And then I saw the huge woman standing by my car, slipping a piece of paper under my wiper. And I started yelling to the cashier that there she was, if he'd just look. And the idiot absolutely flat out refused. He wasn't falling for my crap, quote unquote, and I begged and pleaded, and eventually he did look. And you know what? By the time this lazy-ass cashier took a look, the woman had squeezed herself into her own comically tiny smart car and zoomed off. I told the cashier that I would take my business elsewhere, with a lot more profanity, and went outside to see what the creepy woman had left on my windshield. Now, it was a note that just read, "Carl will be over at 6," in this very barely legible writing. And the next day, I made it to my brother's. I told him everything that had happened, and he was especially creeped out because the woman sounded word for word like the assistant that we had at kindergarten who'd just been a little slow and who just kind of sat in the corner looking at the kids. Except this would have been maybe 20 years ago, and he was sure that from the description that she sounded the same age. The really creepy part, when at 6 p.m. on the dot, the doorbell rang, and my brother answered it, and it was one of his buddies, Kyle. Not quite Carl, but close enough. But he'd only dropped around to hang out, and that was no mystery really there. And I hung out with my brother for about a week and then headed home. When I reached home, I had a message from my brother. And on his way from leaving my brother's place, Kyle got into a car accident. He had 2 broken legs, but was set to make a full recovery. So was it a coincidence, or did this woman somehow have a premonition of Kyle and not Carl getting into an accident? And if so, why did she tell me what time he'd be visiting? I don't believe in the paranormal. I think it was weird and a creepy coincidence where we can see patterns where there was none. But I can tell you one thing. I never use public restrooms anymore, and I'd rather get caught peeing in the public than open a stall door and see that woman standing on the toilet, staring blankly over my head. In May 1996, two young women disappeared into the quiet depths of Virginia's Shenandoah Forest and were later found dead at their secluded campsite, bound and silenced far from any trailhead. What should have been a peaceful hiking trip became a grim mystery whispered among the trees. Hear the full story over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, linked down below. Now enjoy the stories. More than 3 decades ago, back when I was a much younger man, I helped a mate of mine move down to Glasgow from our home city of Newcastle. He'd managed to get a job as a football scout for Glasgow Rangers, which was basically his dream career. And so while me and all of our mates were sad to see the back of him, we were all really proud of him too. Now, we drove up early in the morning, and then once everything was unloaded, we had some pub grub and a few lagers, shandies from me, and then I started on the drive back to Newcastle. I'd left it quite late to drive back, so it was about midnight by the time I started to see signs for the English borders. The roads were quiet, with only the occasional lorry thundering past me, and I remember there being some phone-in thing on the radio, but I wasn't really listening. I was in my old Vauxhall Cavalier, an '82 model that I bought on the cheap about 4 years prior. It normally served me well, and it had been running fine all day, but just after passing a place called Jedburgh, the temperature warning light flicked on. I looked at my dash, watching the needle climbing into the red, and swore under my breath as I eased off the accelerator. Since it normally bought me a few minutes, I cranked the heater up full blast to try and pull some heat out of the engine. But that time, it seems my luck finally ran out, because just a minute or so later, there was this loud hiss from under the bonnet before steam started pouring out the seams. Seconds later, I heard this horrible metallic knocking sound coming from under the bonnet, and so I coasted over to the hard shoulder and then came to a stop just in time for the engine to seize up completely. And after that, aside from the ticking of my hazard lights and the sound of hot metal cooling down, there was nothing but silence for a few seconds, until I erupted. I remember shouting, "Are you effing kidding me?" a couple of times, and then, after taking a few deep breaths, I got out of the car and tried to fix it. And I tried it for half an hour, and in that time, a grand total of 2 cars passed me, but even with me waving at them as they passed, neither of them stopped. I didn't just stand there like some plonker for the whole 30 minutes, mind you. I popped my bonnet not long after getting out, but when I did, a load of steam and the smell of burnt coolant came wafting up into my face. And after waving away some of the steam, I spotted a crack in the top radiator hose and then noticed how loads of antifreeze was dripping onto the road and forming a big green puddle. I didn't have a spare hose, and neither did I have enough water to top it up properly, and even if I had, the engine had overheated so badly that I didn't trust it not to seize up again. Basically, I wasn't going anywhere in my old Vauxhall, and since there were no mobile phones back then, at least none for the likes of me, I had no choice but to walk if I wanted to get myself some help. Now, I reckon the nearest emergency phone would have been about a mile down the road, maybe more, and so I locked my car, left my hazards flashing, and then started walking along the dark grass verge with a torch in my hand. Now, I thought I'd be on the move for quite a while, but then no sooner had I started walking, I came to a dirt track, previously concealed by a long hedgerow, which led to what looked like a big 3-story farmer's house. Now, I was so happy that I was literally punching the air, because despite the fact that there were no lights switched on the ground floor, there was what looked to be candlelight in both the front-facing upstairs rooms. I felt bad for calling so late, but since the alternative of walking along the motorway was a much more dangerous one, I reckoned that I didn't have much choice. It was a particularly dark night, small moon and cloud cover, so it was only once I got closer to the house that I saw how run down it was. The ground floor windows were either cracked or newspapered over, and there were cracks in the wood too, along with a lot of peeling paint. And as you can imagine, I started to get really bad vibes from the place. But I try not to judge books by their cover too much because you tend to be rewarded more times than you're burned for it. And so with that in mind, and granted very foolishly, I decided to knock on the door. I didn't knock too loud or aggressively. I didn't want to frighten anyone. But when my first knock got no answer, I knocked a little bit louder. Again, there was complete silence. No footsteps behind the door, no talking inside, nothing. But then after taking a step back and looking up at the top windows, I saw someone peeking out at me from behind a dirty-looking curtain. And I can't lie, it did scare me a bit seeing a pair of eyes staring back at me through the dim light. But as soon as I reacted, the eyes disappeared and I began to hear voices inside the house. Now it sounded like a fair number of people, maybe half a dozen, and they were whispering like they were talking among themselves. I heard a little voice in my head saying, "They're awake, knock again." But before I could even dismiss it, I heard the sound of someone laughing inside the house. Not loudly though, more like a muted sort of wheeze as they tried to keep their voice low. The bad vibes that I was getting ramped up to 11, so instead of risking a confrontation with whoever was either living or more likely squatting there, I decided to make a move. I turned around and walked back up the dirt path as fast as I could, looking over my shoulder every so often to make sure that no one was following me. Now, I was quite certain whoever was inside was watching me from those windows, but as long as they didn't follow me, then I didn't mind what they did. I'd almost gotten to the end of the path to where those two wooden gateposts held no gate when I started smelling something strong on the breeze, something that smelled like burning. And then when I turned the corner and could see out onto the road again, I felt this almost involuntary scream jump out of my mouth as I realized what the smell was. It was my car. My car was on fire. Now, I suppose I acted on complete instinct in running over to it because there was absolutely bugger all I could do about putting out that fire. All I could do was just stand there, effing and blinding and looking around for whoever might have done it. But as you can probably guess, there was no one, and the whole area looked deserted. And I knew for a fact that it wasn't. When I realized just how much of a bad situation I truly was in, I started jogging along the road until I got back on the motorway. Now, it was only a 4-lane carriageway, so I could walk along the verge without being in too much danger, but no matter how much danger passing cars posed to me, it still seemed safer than hanging around my burning car in that creepy house. Now, I think probably about a half an hour must have passed with only the odd car going past me, and in that time, I didn't try to get anyone's attention just in case it was the people from the home. I mean, the joke was on them in a sense because that poor cavalier was definitely on her way out, but on the off chance they wanted to do more than just burn my car, I had to be very careful about who I revealed myself to. Now, I was bloody nervous for that first half an hour, but after that, I started to calm down a wee bit. I hadn't seen any cars or anything parked outside the house, and if they really did want to chase me down for whatever reason, I reckoned that I'd have encountered them already. So once I'd calmed down a bit, and after maybe 2 or 3 more cars passed me with me sticking to the trees on the verge, I made my way to the edge of the road and then stuck my thumb out at what looked like a Land Rover of some kind coming my way. Now it slowed down as the driver saw me, but then instead of switching on the light above the wheel, someone in the passenger seat started shining a torch in my face after lowering their window. And right away, I knew that wasn't promising behavior when I realized whoever was in the car didn't want to be seen, and I turned and started walking away. Now, a second later, I heard a very promising, "Need a lift, pal?" Now, one that was just friendly enough to slow me down and make me think that I might have been overreacting. But then the second I slowed, I turned back to face the car, and the passenger doors opened up and I heard someone shout, "Get him!" Now I remember running right at the trees at the side of the road. Not along the road where the car would have been able to cut me off, but at and then through the trees and bushes at the side of the road. I remember closing my eyes as I felt things scratching against my face, and then when I opened them, I found that I'd come to a fence on the other side. I hopped over it with speed and power that I didn't even know I had in me. I mean, I was hardly some couch potato back then, but I wasn't exactly in perfect shape either. But I swear, I think I vaulted that fence like an Olympic athlete for fear of what might have happened if those men had caught up with me. It's strange thinking back on it as well, because these days, all I do sometimes is sit and wonder why those people chose to go after me like they did. But in the moment, as I was running, it didn't matter a jot to me. All I knew was that those people were out to get me, and all that mattered in the world was getting away from them in that moment. Now, I ran across this big dark field for what felt like ages, running and running until I couldn't anymore. And then when I got to the other side and spotted a road ahead of me, I swear I saw that same Land Rover driving along the road with someone shining a torch out into the field. I had to change my route and head off at an angle to avoid the Land Rover, and along with anyone to my rear who might have followed me. I had to force myself to run when I didn't think that I could run anymore, and even though I was quite a fit young lad and one pumped full of adrenaline, I soon felt like that I was about to cough up a lung and fall over. In the end, I found myself staggering onto a road and then right back onto another dark field because I was too scared to be out in the open with a car full of blokes trying to find me. I kept on going like that until I came across a small town. And then as I was walking its dark and empty streets, looking for anyone who might be able to help, a police car appeared, and an officer asked what I was doing walking the streets alone like that. When I told him what had happened to me, he told me to jump in the car, and then off we went to the police station for a cup of hot tea and a few biscuits, while I went into more detail about what had happened. As soon as I mentioned the house that I'd stopped by and mentioned how there had been people inside, I remember these two officers giving each other a look because they told me that the people inside must have been squatters. I thought that they might have been, partly because of how run down the house was, but the police confirmed that it was derelict and that there shouldn't have been anyone in there. They said that they'd head over and check it out, but they doubted anyone would be there. Squatters are kind of like rats. They're annoying and sometimes they're dangerous, but they're not stupid, and they just move on someplace else and then maybe return when things all blew over. But in all likelihood, they were gone from that house for good. I remember asking the two policemen why, as in why had they burned my car before trying to hunt me down like that? And the first words out of the policemen's mouths were, "Well, what did you see?" He was convinced that I'd seen them doing something that they shouldn't have been doing, and after spotting my car, which they assumed was still functional, they tried to make sure that I couldn't get away before chasing me down. But that was the thing. I hadn't seen anything, and once I'd established that, all we could think of was that those squatters just wanted to scare me off. One of the policemen said that since they didn't know who I was, they might have assumed that I was some kind of bailiff or law enforcement agent. And at first, they might have been worried that I was a policeman. But then when they realized that I wasn't, they must have reckoned that I was fair game for a kicking. And if only to make sure that I was too scared to return. And with nothing else to say, I gave the police the phone number for my flat in Newcastle. And then, since I literally lost everything but my wallet, one of them was kind enough to give me a lift to a nearby train station. It was long past dawn by then, so the trains were running, and I didn't have to wait long before I was on my way back to Newcastle. They phoned a few days later saying that that house was empty, and there wasn't much in the way of evidence tying anyone to the arson. They promised to keep their ears to the ground and would let me know immediately if there was any progress, but till then, they advised me to be patient because things like that took time. Sadly, that was the last I heard from the police, marking the end of my first encounter with squatters, and hopefully my last, too. I had no idea that those people could be so violent. I mean, call me naive, but the squatters I was familiar with were the hippies who took over empty houses in London in the 60s. I thought that they'd be more into peace protests and drum circles than chasing down strangers. But I suppose times had changed then, and people changed with them. Almost 10 years ago now, way back in September of 2016, I drove all the way from LA to Phoenix to visit an old high school friend. Now, I was 31 and female, but still Hispanic and still small, and I drove out on a Friday and we spent all day Saturday together, Then, even though I planned to drive back home in the mid-afternoon on Sunday, I didn't end up leaving until about 9 p.m. at night. Now I know I should have left earlier, and I know what I'm about to tell you is basically my own damned fault for not sticking to my plan. But even so, there are still nights sometimes, even all this time later, when I find myself waking up from nightmares with a cold sweat forming on my chest, having relived it all over again in my sleep. It was just after midnight when I rolled into Riverside County after passing over the Arizona state line. Now, a few people were still up in that area, so it wasn't completely dead, but after I passed the airport and the Mesa Verde complex, the 10 got super quiet again, and it seemed like there was no one but me out there for miles and miles. I was just trying to keep myself awake with some music and by blasting some cold air when suddenly I noticed a pair of headlights in my rear view. Someone was coming up on me, and really fast too, and seeing how fast they were going, I honestly figured it was the police. I didn't panic or anything, I wasn't doing anything wrong, and I didn't have anything in the car that I shouldn't have, and so I just sat tight, kept my speed, and let them get closer and closer. When they got so close their headlights were blinding me if I looked up into the rear view, I figured they'd pass and keep going. But they stayed put, right behind me in the same lane, and didn't budge for at least a couple of minutes. I'm trying to figure out if these guys really are cops, because it looked like they were driving in one of those big sliding door vans. Only this one was all blacked out, like even the windows looked like they were tinted. Now, there was nothing on it to say that they were police, and no lights on the top either, so I started getting really nervous thinking, what the hell do these guys want with me? Like I said, they stayed behind me like that for a couple of minutes, and then by the time they dropped back a little, they sped up to try and pass me, and I was actually super relieved. Now, I thought because they weren't trying to follow anymore, I was out of danger, when in reality, I was in more danger than I could have ever even imagined. I just let them pass, because what the heck was I going to do? But then instead of passing me and speeding off, the black van pulled back into the same lane as me and then started cruising maybe 10 to 15 minutes in front like it was trying to block me. I thought, oh, big deal, right? Like I could just slow down and lose them. But I didn't think that I'd need to, so I didn't. I stayed right where I was, slowing only a little to just a safe distance between us, and then kept on cruising just like the van was. I had no idea what they were up to, and I think maybe curiosity really did almost kill the cat here, because when the van's rear doors swung open and I saw a man in leathers with some kind of bandana wrapped around his face, I kind of just froze up. I couldn't think of a single good reason why he'd want to open the back doors like that, and for a second I thought that he might be planning on jumping out for some reason. I don't know what I was thinking. All I did was lean on the brake a little and put just a little more feet between myself and that van. I just had no idea that I'd moved right where he wanted me. I dropped back a little more, still wondering what the hell these guys were doing and why they didn't have any plates on the back of their van. I then watched as the man with the bandana around his mouth began to smile at me. I obviously couldn't see his mouth, but I could see it in his eyes. That, or the dust was getting to him, because it's like he squinted before turning his back on me and carefully leaning down to grab something. Now, I might sound crazy or dumb to y'all who are reading this back in almost slow-mo, and maybe I was just too tired and slow or naive as heck, but I could not conceive of what he was about to do next, no matter how obvious it seems looking back on it. And so I just watched as the guy hauled something up into his arms, turned around, and then tossed it out onto the freeway in front of him. I saw what it was way too late, and I guess that moment of panic really did slow me down, but I had just enough in me to turn the wheel at just the right moment, so that when that old engine block came bouncing up off the blacktop, it smashed into my windshield on the passenger side and not into me. And once it hit, instinct told me to slam on the brakes, and so that's what I did, bringing my car to a spinning, screeching stop. Before I realized that I was covered in glass and there was basically a giant gaping hole where my windshield used to be. I just remember sitting there and shaking after I turned off my engine, and then I got out, walked to the side of the highway with my phone and dialed 911. And it wasn't until I described exactly what had happened as calmly as I could that I suddenly just broke down when the operator told me to stay on the line while she transferred me to someone. And after that, it was a case of guiding the cops and EMS to where I was so I could be taken to the ER. Aside from a few cuts and some mild whiplash, I was pretty much good to go, but I was reminded of just how lucky I'd been by that doctor. The cops had said the same thing, and that's why I say reminded, but at the time it didn't all the way feel lucky, and it wouldn't for quite some time. I knew I was lucky to be alive, and it wasn't like I was completely blind to how lucky I'd been in that respect, but all I could think about in the months afterwards was, why me? Like, why did they pick me of all the people they could have picked to throw a damn engine at? Like, I know they were trying to kill me. I just want to know what it was about me that made them think, yeah, this is the one. Let's turn her into hamburger meat. The cops didn't find that van or the people inside it, and I don't mean any disrespect to the boys in blue when I say this, but I didn't have much faith that they would. It was a black van, no plates, traveling in the middle of the damn night in the middle of the damn desert, and it might as well have been a ghost. And that fits too, because you know something? It sure as heck haunts me like one. More than 20 years ago now, back when my son James was still in elementary school, we took a trip down to Bethesda, Maryland from New York so he could see his grandma. Now, it was kind of messed up from the start, I guess, because I had something come up at work on the Friday we planned to leave. And this meant that I couldn't get on the road until about 8:30 in the evening, meaning I wouldn't arrive in Bethesda till after midnight at the latest. Now, I called ahead to my mom and made sure that was all okay, and she wasn't happy at having less time with her grandson, but there really wasn't much that could be done. And so after getting her to agree to stay up later than usual, me and James hit the road. About 2 hours into the journey, I stopped at a little gas station in Maryland when I realized I needed a coffee and a bite to eat. James was asleep in the back seat, and I was worried about waking him up as I shut my car door, but he was still at that age where when he was out, and his eyes stayed closed after I shut the door. I got one of those big, super strong gas station coffees, a soda for James, and then a bag of those mini powdered donuts because I knew all that sugar would push me through the rest of the way. And then after walking back to my car, I found James was awake. And thinking that shutting my car door really had woken him up, I apologized and then turned in my seat to hand him his drink. And that's when I saw the key ring that he was now holding. At first glance, it looked like a little clown holding a sign of some description. And I asked him what it was while taking a look at it and saw how the clown's little sign read, Flying Plow Circus. It wasn't plastic either, like it was mass-produced. It was wooden and looked almost handmade. And when I asked James where he got it, he said a man had given it to him. Now naturally, this didn't ring any alarm bells at first, and I was about to just let it go. But then I asked when the man gave it to him, to which James replied, a minute ago, while you were in the store. Again, this didn't scare me like it should have, because I'd locked my door. Now, I'd never leave my kid in an unlocked car like that while I went into a store, and since sleepy 6-year-olds aren't the most reliable and frequently play pretend, I didn't really take them seriously. But that's when James said something along the lines of, yeah, he did something funny to the door, like, then it opened, then he told us to go visit sometime. Now, I remember my pulse getting faster as I asked James if he was serious, and if he was sure. He told me he wasn't lying, and that the man used some kind of wire to open the door. Now, by the time he said that, my heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. I asked what the guy looked like, and James just said, normal. And then as I got out of my car and looked around the parking lot, I don't think I'd ever been so close to a panic attack in my whole life. I tried to calm myself down as best I could, and then I asked James to tell me the whole story again from start to finish. He was starting to pick up on my vibe, so he was starting to get all confused and kind of upset, and I had to assure him that he hadn't done anything wrong and that he just needed to tell me what happened, and then he went over it with me a second time. It made my skin crawl to think about, and it still does. The thought of some creep watching people, waiting for an opportunity to break into someone's car so they could creep on their kid. Like, I know all the guy did was give James a keyring, but that's his cover story, right? All he's doing is giving the kid a keyring till the parents take too long coming back, and then it's diddling or abduction time. I asked James if he said or did anything weird or if he acted in a weird or creepy way, and James said the only weird thing he said was, "Your dad knows me." And even though he was 6, he was skeptical seeing that we didn't even live there. I was freaked out, y'all. The idea of what might have happened scared the hell out of me, but once I saw that there was no one around for me to blame, that fear turned to frustration and then straight up anger. I think if James had pointed someone out like that's him, I'd have straight up torched that dude, and I'd be writing this from prison or something. Not that a jury in their mother effing land would convict me of something like that, but you see my point. I told James to hand me the key ring, and then told him if anything like that ever happened again, he should yell for me, as loud as he could, and he wasn't to stop until I'd appeared to protect him. I told him he'd been very brave and he hadn't done anything wrong, and then gave him the speech on how not everyone who acts friendly wants to be friends. And then once all that was said and done and my heart rate had returned to normal, sort of, we got back on the road again. I remembered the name of the road that I was on a couple of minutes later because I looked it up later when I decided to call the cops. It was called Conowingo Road, a name I don't think I'll ever forget because I was driving down and I saw the sign saying Flying Plow Circus 1 mile ahead. I remember how the rage boiled up in me like you wouldn't believe, and I actually put my foot down thinking I'm going to give these a-holes a piece of my mind. I powered along the highway, probably dipping over the speed limit a couple of times till I finally found the sign saying Flying Plow Circus next right. I don't know exactly what I was planning. Maybe just find where the carnies' trailers were, then curse up a storm on how they needed to keep a leash on their pedo coworkers before he gets himself shot. I wasn't dumb enough to start a fight with a whole bunch of random circus folk, and I wasn't about to let their buddy get away with what he did either. But then after making the turn and driving down this dark dirt road to where a circle of trailers were sat, I changed my mind completely. If I could describe that collection of trailers in 2 words, those 2 words would be horror and movie. And there was a fire in the middle of them and a bunch of people gathered around it. And then when they saw my car, I saw a couple of them turn to look at me. I couldn't make much out. They were just these dark shapes with the fire in the background, but that made them even creepier looking. I realized that it might not be a case of one rogue carny, and for all I know, the whole gang might have sent that one guy out looking for a kid to snatch and bring back to them. Now, I just kept on watching them, watching me for maybe half a minute more, and then after taking one look at James in the back, who by then had fallen back asleep, I thought, screw this, and then turned around and drove off. Now, before James was born, if something like that happened where someone made me mad enough to hunt them down, then yeah, maybe I'd have gotten my car and been dumb enough to get my ass kicked by a dozen pissed-off carnival folk. But after he was born, it was like I had this safety software installed onto my brain where everything I did sparked the thought of, how is this going to end for me? There was no point trying to defend him from something I wouldn't survive confronting, because being a parent is literally all about living to fight another day. Life's not a game anymore for me. I have to do everything I can to protect my kid, and it's just scary as hell when you try and do all the right things and still end up with some creep breaking into your car. I called the cops from my mom's place that next day after telling her all about the man, the key ring, and all the signs from the Flying Plow Circus. They called me back basically saying that they'd been stonewalled and that no one admitted to slipping out from their camp after dark, not even for a second. And that's what confirmed it for me. If they were just a bunch of innocent, good-natured carnies just making their way in the world, then I doubt that they'd have stonewalled a pair of cops who came around asking about a kitty creeper. If there was some sketchy loner on my crew and I thought that they were up to no good, and I mean really up to no good, I'd want them gone. So the fact that they all sort of said, "I don't know what you're talking about, officers," and that made me think that they were in on it and they were just covering for their boy. On the journey back from my mom's and while driving in daylight, I slowed near that turn that I'd seen the trailers on but didn't see any signs for the Flying Plow Circus. Now, I'm guessing that they moved on after the visit from the cops, and after looking it up, I don't think the whole Flying Plow thing was their regular name. Flying Plow something, I can't remember if it was a road or a lane or whatever, was the name of the place that they set up on, so wherever they went, They'd probably put up some new signs and under a new name, and then on they'd go. I don't even know if they were running an actual circus. I saw plenty of trailers, but no big top. But what I do know is that one of them went out looking for kids, and almost certainly for no good reason at all. My name's Hank. I'm a proud Texan, and I work as a bus driver taking folks all over this great state of ours. Most of those journeys take place during the day, but sometimes I like to earn a little extra pay by taking the overnight journeys, or what you might call the red eyes. I fire up that big old rig around dusk, load her up with the sleepy travelers heading either home or away, and then take off along those long, lonely highways that stretch from Houston to El Paso and every place in between. I wouldn't call it a difficult job, but as long as you can keep the wheels turning through the witching hours and dodge all those back road deer, you can almost guarantee everybody gets where they're going safe and sound by sunup. And it's not often the bus causes you problems, because if you keep her clean and well-oiled, and she'll keep you moving and happy. It's the people that complicate things, though. Not every kind of person, but a certain kind, and all the worst rides have been down to that certain kind of person. Including this one, which was probably the worst I have ever experienced. Driving the bus across Texas at night with nothing but country songs and the stars to keep me company, it sometimes makes me feel like a night watchman, one charged with guarding the whole damn state. Now, I meet all kinds of interesting people on that open road under the big Texas sky, and then watching the sun rise over the prairies after a long shift, it's pure gold, but the cons hit hard too. Your sleep schedule gets all turned around, so whenever you're working nights, you miss out double on family dinners and weekends with the kids. The fatigue creeps up on you too, and dealing with rowdy passengers or breakdowns in the middle of nowhere is no picnic. But every so often, you get a special kind of rowdy, the kind that's not just drunk and loud or complaining about fellow passengers' body odor, the kind that's dangerous, real dangerous. Back during the fall of 2007, I was on a run from Dallas to Austin, driving through the pitch black with nothing but tumbleweeds and truck stops for miles. I had this fella riding with me about 6 rows back, one that had been staring out the window and kind of muttering to himself, at least according to a fellow passenger anyway. I couldn't hear him at first, so it must have been nothing but a few grumbles and not enough to cause a scene. But then after maybe an hour on the road, I started hearing him as he started to raise his voice. I looked up into my mirror to see folks shifting uncomfortably in their seats, but nobody said a word. That happens more often than not. People learn to tune out the oddballs on long bus rides like that, but the guy didn't get any quieter. He only got louder, and as he did, the tension in the air got thicker and thicker. My guy twisted something fierce knowing trouble was simmering, and I just prayed that it'd blow over, sort of like a false alarm, but it didn't. When it came, the guy went off like a firecracker on the 4th of July, almost like his fuse was sizzling away for a while, and then bang, off he went, and there was no stopping him. I heard someone say something to him, I guess a sort of shut up or something to that effect, and the guy replied with a full-throated roar, and then went at that challenger like a freaking skunk pig. I looked back for just a second to see him leaning across the center aisle, lunging at the person I assumed did the back-talking. I had to keep my eyes on the road, but I looked up into the mirror to see fists raining down, and then the sound of passengers screaming along with a doom, doom, doom of the big guy's fists against the other's face. They weren't fighting. It was like a beating, the kind that, if it wasn't stopped, was going to end in a casket and a family dressed in black. The bus exploded into chaos as the beating continued, with some people running for cover toward the rear and others charging the attacker to try and end the assault. And when he realized what was going on, the attacker sort of wheeled around and started swinging on the folks trying to stop him. And let me tell you, this man was no small specimen. From what I could tell, he made short work of the people trying to stop him, and I think he straight up knocked a guy out too, because something freed him up to go back to wailing on the first guy he attacked, who by then was out cold and leaking blood from his nose and mouth. I didn't get a picture of all of this until later, obviously, because I was mostly trying to keep my eyes on the road while keeping an eye on the situation behind me using my driver's mirror. But then as soon as I realized the violence wasn't about to stop anytime soon, I started slowing us down so I could pull us over and get as many people as possible off that bus. I didn't hit the brakes in a sort of screaming tires kind of way. You can't do that on the bus with people standing unless you want them falling head first. And while I didn't mind if our psycho attacker banged his head on an armrest, I had to consider the other passengers too. I brought the bus to the side of the road as fast as I could, which felt painfully slow given what was happening right behind me. And then once we'd come to a stop, I opened up the doors and began hollering for people to get out as quickly as they could. I think I herded about 12 to 14 people out of the front, and there were women clutching their children, a couple of old-timers who couldn't move as fast, but everyone else moved like greased lightning. Everyone except the people trapped on the back of the bus who were being blocked from the front exit by our raging psycho. We had an emergency exit at the back of the bus, so I started yelling at the people in the back to pull the lever and push the door open so they could all scramble out onto the road. I don't know if they just couldn't hear what I was saying over the sound of their screams or they were too scared to turn their backs on that attacker, but they didn't do as I asked. I kept on yelling louder and louder, but then the psycho turned his attention to me and then came charging down the bus while roaring like some beast. I tried to put something between us, that something being the driver's seat, but as most of you can probably imagine, all he had to do was move a yard to the side and his fists had unfettered access to my face. I felt a couple of punches and kicks, but all I could do was try and shield my head in the hopes that he didn't do any serious damage. At one point, the guy actually grabbed one of my arms by the wrist and pulled it away so he could punch me right in the eye. All it took was one punch, and it felt like I couldn't see out of it anymore, and I knew it'd only take a couple of more of that to do some serious damage. The same pattern played out again, with people trying to get him off of me before being beaten back, and then he turned back to me and started all over again, but he didn't last long because maybe a second or two later all I heard was, "Hey, right here!" It was a young voice, almost sounded a bit like a kid's, and then bam, there was a gunshot, and then I heard that attacker start to groan. I looked around, the vision in my right eye still kind of cloudy, and I saw the attacker was curled up on the floor of the bus near the exit stairs, and he was clutching at his belly with a blood stain getting bigger and bigger on his shirt. Standing over him was this black kid with a gun. And I say kid as he must have been in his late teens, probably early 20s, but there he was, standing over the guy with a smoking pistol telling him if he tried to get up, he'd blow his head off. With the attacker put down, and with all the fight having left him, the other passengers were able to get off the bus. People were treating the kid with the gun like he was some hero, but all he seemed interested in was getting out of there. I told him to hold his horses because the cops wouldn't arrest a man for defending people like he did. But he turned to me and, with a sort of scared look in his eye, he says, "It ain't legal. It ain't legal, man. I gotta go. I gotta go now." And then off he went. Lord knows where, and that's honestly the last I saw of him. With folks huddled outside in the cold, yes, Texas nights can get cold, I called in what had just happened on my cell and then waited with the rest while they either cried, hugged each other, or just stared into space like I did, wondering how the heck things all went so bad so fast. And not long after, we all saw lights flashing red and blue across the flatlands, and then as they got closer, they were joined by sirens. State troopers rolled up first. Their guns were drawn so they could secure the scene, and then I gave them the lowdown on that berserker. I mentioned the shooter too, and I know I should have been honest with him, and I might have been a little selective over what I remembered because God knows I didn't want that kid's good deed treated like a bad one. Once the cops had the scene secure, the EMTs came right behind them. They hauled off that unconscious fella with his face all busted up and then stretchered off that young woman too, the one the attacker had given a few hard licks. And they even checked the attacker too, who was still alive but in a lot of pain, and then with him handcuffed to a stretcher, they took him away with a cop sitting in the back of the ambulance with him. The cops questioned everybody, taking statements while I stood there feeling like I'd aged a decade in about an hour. And the company I worked for got a replacement bus out to us as quickly as they could, and then once the dust settled and the authorities cleared us to go, we were back on the road again. We were minus a couple of passengers because some had chosen to wait for kin or friends so they could ride with them instead, but we were also plus one because I got to sit back and enjoy the ride with the new driver at the wheel. The atmosphere on the bus now was pretty dark, with folks whispering to each other about what had just happened, but I preferred the talk because when it came, the silence was honestly heavier than a lead blanket. I still think about that kid sometimes, the one who shot our attacker before he could do any serious damage to me. I guess if you told me about a guy like that walking around with an illegal gun, I'd have assumed that he was the bad guy. And I guess he sort of was one of the bad guys if he was a felon or what have you. But then all it took was one pull of the trigger at that right moment, and he became kind of a hero to me. I know there's no such thing as a perfect person, but since that night, I've never been so convinced of the existence of flawed heroes. So I used to drive taxis in Liverpool back in the 80s. Now, it was great money for what it was, and so even though I only planned on doing it long enough to find a replacement for the job I'd lost, I ended up driving for almost 3 years before I finally gave up. A big appeal was that I could work when I wanted. If I had something that needed doing in the daytime, be it something with the kids' school or whatever, I could just take a few hours off, take care of business, and then head out on the jobs again at night to make up the hours. And there was no doing that in a factory or down on the docks, not without getting your pay docked anyway. But it wasn't all sunshine and roses, and I remember one particular job where for a minute or two, it didn't look like I was going to make it home to my family that night. It started when a job came through just after 10 p.m., asking me to take someone from Agberth Vale to Anfield. I got the address, drove over, and then parked up outside a small 2-up, 2-down on a dark and quiet street. I didn't want to beat my horn, which was the usual method of letting a customer know that we were outside, so I gave dispatch a buzz on my radio and asked them to call the customer back to let them know that I was waiting. Dispatch said no one picked up the phone, but then maybe a second or two later, I saw someone walking out of a house and towards my car. Now, as I said, it was dark, so even though I saw the shape of them moving towards the back passenger door, I didn't get a good look at them until they were sitting behind me, and when I did, I almost pissed my kecks. He was wearing a balaclava, and after he shut the door, he sank down low in the seat to make it harder for him to be seen from the outside. Now, he had what looked like a jerry can of petrol in one gloved hand, and then with the other, he pulled out what looked like an old detective gun from his jacket, like a proper six-shooter, and pointed it directly at me. He said if I tried to run, I'd be shot. In fact, if I did anything that even remotely upset him, I was a dead man. Now, my only job was to do what he said, and when he said it, and if I did, I'd go home alive that night. And so, seeing as I didn't have much of a choice, I drove where he told me to go. We ended up parked up across from a pub not far from the Rialto on Upper Parliament Street, I remember, and the lad in the back told me to turn off the engine and then spent the next 15 minutes or so checking his watch and peering up over the solid part of the door to watch the pub through the window. He kept on checking his watch, and I kept getting the urge to try and talk him out of whatever he was about to do. But every time the words were about to come out, something stopped them. I stayed quiet, and then noticed that when the clock on my dash hit 11 p.m., the lad in the back started getting even twitchier. When I noticed people coming out of the pub, obviously around kick-out time, the lad told me to start the engine. He was watching the pub doors like a hawk, and then suddenly, he started rolling down the window all frantically before he pointed the gun out the window, shouted something I couldn't make out, and pulled the trigger. One of the fellas who just walked out of the pub hit the concrete like a wet sack of spuds. Someone screamed, and then the guy in the back seat let out a scream of his own as he told me to drive. I obviously had to stay under the speed limit where possible, but it was tough with a gun pressed in the back of my head every so often, with its owner telling me that if I stopped for the police or took us down any dead ends, I'd be getting one to the back of the dome. The lad directed me to drive all the way out towards Speke to some of the derelict land near where the airport is today. He told me to get out of the car and then started emptying that can of petrol all over the seats after joining me outside. And that was the closest I had got to trying to do something when I realized that I was about to lose my car. I know that probably sounds horrible, seeing as I didn't do anything about him shooting that fella outside the pub, but I wasn't really in any position to do anything back then, whereas watching him pour that gasoline with his back to me, I knew that there was a very slim chance that I'd be able to get the drop on him. But if I didn't, I was a dead man. And so I basically talked myself out of it in my head and then watched as he set my car on fire and then ran off into the darkness. I just remember feeling numb. Less than an hour before, I hadn't even received the job yet, and then just a short while after parking outside that house to pick them up, my life had been changed forever. We obviously didn't have any phones back then, so I couldn't just call the police with a mobile like I would now. I had to walk all the way to a payphone, which took quite a while before I could contact the police, and only then could I give them any details. All I wanted to do was go home, get in the bath, and crack open one of the beers that I had waiting for me in the fridge. But the police wanted me to wait where I was so I could guide them to where my car had been dumped. It honestly didn't take all that long, and I'm grateful the police got out to me so fast, but the last thing in the world I wanted to do was go back to where my car was still smoldering and repeat my story for a second time. But I had to, because the most important thing was making it really bloody clear that my part in the murder was an unwilling one, and I did that by giving them as much info as possible on the man that had done the shooting. But when they asked if I'd be willing to appear in a court at a later date, I told them no. Call me a coward, but to me, you'd have to be mental to testify against some gangster in this city. Maybe if I was in London or New York or somewhere like that, but not Liverpool, because everyone knows everyone around here. And they said that I might get asked again if murder detectives were put on the case and they found someone they wanted to charge. But the fact that I never got that call is the only proof that I need that they didn't catch anyone. I used to have nightmares about it too, proper horrible ones as well. But nowadays I just have these dreams. Not quite nightmares, but still clear enough for me to remember when I wake up in the morning. And sometimes in those dreams I do what I wanted to do in the moment and beg the killer to reconsider. But no matter what I say and no matter how I say it, he never, ever listens. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your own story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, the beacons are lit. Gondor calls for aids. I started a new high school in junior year. I was an army brat and I moved around a lot. Unlike a lot of kids who had this kind of upbringing, I'm going to break the mold. I loved it. Spend a year or so hanging out with people, make friends who I could keep in touch with, and then move on to something new and exciting. Genuinely wouldn't have changed my child and teenagehood for anything. My new school was no different. I won't name the school or the state or anything like that, even though it was about 2016. Just cautious, I guess. Some of your viewers seem like they're pretty weird folks, not trying to be rude, but I hang out in those live streams sometimes. I'm just kidding. I love all of you. Now anyway, I'm the kind of sad bastard who's into English and writing and aspires to be a journalist or maybe even a novelist. I know, but hey, I have a finished novel. Nowhere close to publishable quality and a work in progress, so at least I'm doing something with my life. But back then, I spent a lot of time writing in the library. Not ashamed to admit that I wrote a bunch of smutty fanfic. Now this isn't relevant to the story, I promise you. You're just not going to have to read about Markiplier having an affair with Justin McElroy, and yes, I did write one about that. The point is, I'd often get engrossed in my dumb smut writing and wouldn't really notice who was around me. And that's why I'm not sure exactly when Andrew started hanging out in the library, sitting a few tables away from me, pretending to read a middle-grade book but clearly watching me. Now let me tell you about Andrew. Andrew was sort of special needs. He was autistic to some degree on the spectrum anyway, and he was kind of mathematical and actually a science whiz. Academically very smart, but he liked reading middle-grade books, and he could not, for the life of him, communicate with his peers very properly. Now, it didn't help that he was hard of hearing, and so he sort of talked with this sort of awkward voice that unfortunately made him sound special. And there were a couple of ASL students at the school, and apparently he could hold the deepest, most intellectual conversations via ASL on the extremely rare time that he could bring himself to engage with someone else. Now, Andrew had taken to watching me. I saw him all over the place. Pretty much everyone I spoke to admitted that this was pretty odd, so don't get me wrong. You'd assume Andrew would be the prime target for bullying, right? Well, wrong. If one of the jocks saw a guy so much as give Andrew a hard time, that guy would regret it. Everyone loved him. He may have been almost incommunicado, but he was sort of like, I don't know. Everyone wanted to look out for the kid, and I mean everyone. And so I was careful who I mentioned Andrew's stalking to. I had a handful of friends that I'd made there, and I did bring it up to them. And at first they sort of said, "You have to be mistaken. Andrew isn't like that. He's a gentle giant." Now I should mention he was nearly 7 feet tall. I'm not kidding. But then I pointed him out, and the way he'd watch me from corners or just openly, and they couldn't deny it. Andrew was, for want of a better word, stalking me. And the first afternoon he followed me home, I knew that I had to do something. But what? I didn't want to turn people on this otherwise harmless special needs student, and all he was really doing is watching me. It wasn't like with lust. You know how you can just tell when someone's lusting after you? It wasn't like that. It was like he was sort of fascinated with me, or that's what it seemed like at first. Maybe this will seem stupid, but I decided to do a bit of stalking my own. I stalked Andrew stalking me, stalkception, and I watched him watching me, and I kept a note of his behavior. One of my friends helped me too, and we came to an extremely odd conclusion. He wasn't stalking me or watching me. He was making sure that he stayed near me. In some ways, this made me feel a little bit better, but it also made me feel more confused. I could not for the life of me work out what his motive was, and I was beginning to feel more and more alone. And then things started getting creepy. I started spotting movement in my yard late at night. My parents both worked for the military, and while we didn't live on base, they often worked late. And my brother was a little 12-year-old brat who was more of an expert at video games than possibly protecting me, though I love my brother, so he really in that moment wasn't going to be much use. But there was someone clearly lurking out there, and the motion detector light would constantly get triggered. Then I found the scraping on my car that looked like someone had tried to break the lock open late at night. Next, there was a note slipped into my locker. I don't want to recount exactly what it said, but it described what someone wanted to do to me. And let's just say it was more Patrick Bateman than Patrick Swayze. It was written in beautiful, exquisite cursive, and this confused me even more. Andrew might have been a savant at many subjects, but penmanship was not one of them. I'd seen his essay work. The handwriting was like a middle schooler. Surely he hadn't somehow persuaded another person to write this disgusting note to me, and meanwhile, he just kept watching me, and he was always just sort of there. And then one day, he wasn't. And I found out through the grapevine that Andrew had an appointment of some kind of neurological clinic and would be gone for a few days, and of course in that moment I felt some relief. Well, the fool I was. That evening I found another note in my locker, even worse than the first, and it actually had blood smeared on it. That night I was alone overnight. It was a Friday. Someone was in my yard and they were making a racket, and I could see this black-clad figure, definitely not Andrew, pulling up plants and weirdly spraying the hose around. Obviously, I called the cops. I even yelled out the window that I called the cops, and the guy didn't leave until almost an hour later when the sound of sirens actually blared off in the distance. Now, I was more confused than ever. There was no doubt that Andrew was stalking me, but then so was someone else. Were they in on it together? It all just seemed so unlikely. And it all came to a head when I was walking home one day. It was sunny, a warm day, so I decided to skip the bus. Who followed behind me, ducking behind walls and hedges? Andrew. Now this wasn't normal, and I was sick of it, and I had to say something, so obviously I turned to confront him. And that's when Andrew charged. Almost 7 feet of muscle barreling towards me from a few hundred feet away, and I was frozen on the spot. And then Andrew veered to the right, and with a scream, he dived into an overgrown hedge on the verge of the park that we were walking past. Out he came, flying with that black-clad figure in his grasp. Andrew slammed this person down and began shaking him back and forward, bouncing his head off the grass, and he was shouting something, but it was hard to tell what in the chaos. I ran forward. I had no idea whose side I was supposed to be on in that moment, and then the black-clad figure's hood fell away, and we made eye contact. He immediately let loose this tirade of disgusting slurs aimed at me, and he seemed under the impression that I duped or hired Andrew into protecting me from him. I had no idea who he was at first, and then one of my friends came running up and yelled, "The janitor?" And the conclusion is absolutely insane. Andrew, and only Andrew, had been observant enough to notice that the janitor was paying unusual attention to me, and from what we could get out of him, he felt a sort of dark aura from it all, and he said that a voice in his head told him to protect me. And so why was that janitor behaving like this to me? So my dad's job in the military is specifically military police. The janitor had been a private about 15 years back, and Dad had been the one responsible for catching him in the middle of assaulting a female officer, and he ensured that he spent time in military jail and was dishonorably discharged. So, when we moved that time, the janitor recognized my dad around town, researched him, discovered he'd had kids, and discovered that I went to the high school that he worked at, and decided to terrorize me. I don't know what kind of voice Andrew heard to protect me. I don't know if I believe in that type of thing, but I do know that I think it saved my life. Maybe he didn't go about it in the best way, but he went about it the only way that he really knew how. And it later turned out that the janitor had even been threatening him, promised to hurt him if he didn't stop watching me, and even that didn't put Andrew off. I did my best to befriend him after that. He wasn't exactly the kind of guy that you could become best of friends with, but I think he knew how grateful I was for what he had done, and I didn't stay at that school for much longer, as Dad's job supposedly called him away, but I think he requested a transfer at that point. I still stay in touch with Andrew via email. We sometimes play chess online, and he kicks my butt every time. We don't really have conversations as such, and it's a weird, strange relationship, really, but he's the guy who saved my life from a pretty dangerous stalker, I think, who, for all I know, would have taken things as far as killing me. So frankly, I'm happy to lose as many chess games to Andrew as he wants. I'm a high school teacher, world history, and I have been for coming up on 25 years now. I sport a buzz cut, I rock a cardigan, and I'm kinda squishy around the middle. And while my wife says it makes me lovable, I make sure that I'm hardly much to look at when it comes to younger people I work with. Now, I don't say the following to brag, though, not at all. If anything, it was a curse, and it was a choice to let myself go. And when I just started out as a teacher in my mid-20s, I was, according to my girlfriend at the time, Hollywood attractive. My wife, who I didn't know at the time, look at old photos of me and say that I look like that Glenn Powell fellow everyone loves these days. Now, I guess I knew I was good looking back in those days. I had flings with more than one of my female coworkers, all single, I'll let you know. And when I wasn't sleeping with a young art teacher or the drama one, I'd prowl the bars for one-night hookups, and you could say that I was a bit of a male slut, I guess. I admit all of this because I want you to know that I want to stress as hard as I can that as soon as I entered the classroom, I became a different person. I wanted to be approachable to the students, sure, but my mentor drummed it into me from day one that I could not become their friend, that I had to inspire them, but I could not take them under my wing, and this was in the very early 2000s too, so imagine how much worse it is now. I knew he wasn't screwing with me. Another teacher at the school I started at had left under a cloud. Supposedly he was having an affair with a male student, and he vehemently denied it. Who knew the truth? But I swore to myself that I would never even wind up in a position where I could be under that suspicion. I like my women mature enough to hold a conversation with me, to be on my level, and most important, goddamn legal. And the idea of being involved with a student sickens me, and I have nothing but contempt for the men and women who go down that path. If it feels like I'm fixating on it, there's a reason. Obviously, despite my best efforts, I found myself in a situation that became a living hell. I'll call her Billy, although that wasn't her real name. She was a senior, had just turned 18, and she really had everything. Head cheerleader, on track to be the prom queen, and a very solid GPA, and there was no reason for her to want more from academia than she did. Except for some reason, she wanted me. Now, when you're a teacher, at least a good one, you can just tell when a student has a crush on you. It's usually harmless. The odd comment, a little lingering after class, and it's easy to put the kibosh on that. But with Billy, it was different. She had a plan, and it started off with very honest-seeming questions about her world history assignments. She'd hang around after class, something I was pretty strict about when it came to having students alone in the classroom, and at first I thought she didn't realize, but it soon became clear that she was intentionally waiting for the classroom to clear before coming to me with questions. Questions I realized that she did not need to ask, being the smart girl that she was. And very quickly, I had to set some firm boundaries. I spoke to some other members of staff and shared my concerns, and they agreed that I was right to be worried. A couple of them had their own experiences with Billy. Nothing too serious, but enough to make them uncomfortable. At the same time, I didn't want to make myself unavailable to students, and so I came up with a structure where my classroom door had to be open up at all times, and my buddy Chris, the English teacher, would conveniently drop by after Billy's world history class when his AP English class also got out. Billy soon stopped trying to get me alone when it became apparent that Chris was here to stay and we were maybe on to her. Now one day, a new member of the admin staff, who wasn't aware of the whole saga, told me that there was a student outside the teacher's lounge asking about me. Now, cup of coffee in hand, I went to see who it was. It had been a month or so since I'd really heard from Billy, so I was a bit surprised to see her standing there. Now, I was even more surprised at the somewhat revealing outfit that she was wearing. Now, I was certain that that did not meet our dress code, but I didn't want to get into all that with her, so I just asked her what was up. Billy told me she was having some trouble with class, despite her grades very much saying the opposite, and asked if she could book some private tutor sessions with me to raise her grade. Of course, I said no, maybe a little too quickly. I felt a pang of guilt and then tried to soften my words a little. I didn't have the time for private lessons. If I offered them to her, then I'd have to offer them to my entire senior class. It just wasn't possible. I did, however, offer her the number of a private tutor who she could hire for further studies, a septuagenarian lady who'd been my world history teacher and tutored occasionally as part of her retirement. And surprisingly, Billy never called the number. I guess the business card caused Billy to sort of snap, because that's when I started finding the typed notes tucked under my windshield. They were typed on those old digital word processors that were popular in the 80s, the follow-up from typewriters, and exactly the kind of technology that a rich family such as Billy's might actually own. Now, this didn't prove anything, of course, but the increasingly weird love letter content did, and I openly ignored them entirely, but made sure to file everyone with the principal. And by now, the entire staff was sure that Billy was the culprit, but A, we had no evidence, and B, we didn't want to accuse an innocent girl, and C, Billy's father was somewhat of a pillar of the community, working in construction building of affordable housing, and also something of a large donor to the school. And they were a decent family, honestly, generous, charitable, and beloved. And if there was some way to handle the Billy situation without ruining her reputation, either at school or with her parents, we wanted to take it. It became harder, though, when those love letters started to become threats. What had started as descriptions of things this person wanted to do to me in a very intimate way shifted into a much more sadist method. It got to the point where myself and the principal were a few notes away from actually going to the cops. What if it wasn't Billy after all? What if it was some sick coincidence? Some woman I hadn't called back after, what I'd considered an agreed one-night stand, or a husband I hadn't been informed about. And this theory kind of fell by the wayside when I found a pair of crotchless panties tucked into a drawer in my desk. I kept my classroom locked and made sure no students could be in there alone, so how she'd gotten in was a complete mystery. And if it was Billy, she didn't want to make a secret of it. There was a crocheted letter above the lack of crotch, and the first letter of her real name, and while that didn't mean anything, part of me wondered if she somehow knew that she'd gone too far and had to take steps to ensure that I knew that it was her. She knew I wouldn't call the cops on her. Now, handing a pair of crotchless panties over to my middle-aged female principal was one of the most embarrassing moments of my entire life, even if they were in an envelope, but I still had to explain what they were and then stand there as she removed and studied them. She told me that this couldn't escalate, that she was genuinely concerned for me at this point, as I was young and good-looking, and no, the principal was not one of the colleagues that I'd hooked up with, and made me promise that no matter how guilty I might feel, if it came to it, the law needed to get involved. We were nearing the end of the semester, though, and prom and graduation and all of that, and then I'd never have to see her again, and I wondered if maybe these panties were her final hurrah. But how wrong I was. Much like many of the staff, I was a chaperone at the prom. Billy was a shoo-in to be prom queen along with her prom king boyfriend, Brad, and I kind of hoped that maybe the romantic win up on stage might change things for her, maybe help whatever was going on in her life. And Christ, looking back, I was a dumb 25-year-old and I really did not understand women or anything really, and I don't remember much about the prom. I remember some students getting rowdy and a couple of ejections for drinking on the premises, and weirdly, my biggest memory, save for the incidents, is just how much Billy Idol, the DJ, played. He was this British guy, and the majority of his repertoire was British music, and I'm not sure how well it landed with the students. But then came the announcement of prom king and queen. Of course, it was Brad and Billy. They took the stage, and Brad gave some gushing speech about how he was with the woman he loved, and he wanted to make her happy for as long as he could, and she'd always be his queen. And then Billy spoke. I'll always remember her opening gambit. She turned to Brad, smacked the crown off his head, and said, "You sicken me." And then she launched into a tirade about how he was a boy playing a man, and how he constantly wanted intimacy, and she said some extremely crude things that did not paint Brad in a good light. And my heart broke for her. But then she turned to me, and told me that I was the one that she was destined to be with, that I was a real man, and we were soulmates, and we were destined to be together. Some absolute joker manning the lights put a spotlight on me, and there was just complete, awkward silence. What could I do? I had no choice but to tell Billy that there was no chance, that she was a child and I was an adult. And I tried to be as kind as possible. I told her that she'd find someone, but it couldn't be me. And I told her that I did not find her attractive, that she was nothing but just some kid to me. I really didn't notice how much it actually broke her. I was staring in my shoes, worried that I couldn't finish my speech if I looked up at her, and I didn't see the tears pouring down her face and all that mascara. But I did hear the slow clapping and then the laughter and erupting from the entire dance hall, all aimed at Billy, the most embarrassing, mortifying moment of her life, and I'd been the cause of it. But I didn't have time to feel guilty. I saw some movements and I saw Billy leaping down off of the stage. I saw her grab the sharp, lengthy knife that was resting near one of the prom cakes, and I saw her charge straight at me, blade raised, prom dress flying behind her, her face blackened by mascara and tears. And I did the only thing I could think to do as someone that was charging at me with a huge carving knife. I used my years of defensive martial arts training to sidestep her and send her sprawling to the ground. Only she didn't hit the ground. She hit a table behind me on which stood another prom sponge cake, and this one was untouched. The knife flew from her hand and Billy slammed straight into that cake and the table collapsing under her weight. Everyone was silent for a moment, and then the crowd erupted with even more laughter. Billy pulled herself to her feet, her prom dress ruined, cake and punch and food all over her, and she turned to me, and she stared at me, and I braced myself for the most terrifying threat of my life, and all Billy said was, "I'm sorry," and then turned around and left the school gym. Now, long story short, Billy quite obviously needed obvious psychiatric help that she'd hidden the need for. She had managed to graduate and with a high GPA, but college wasn't on the cards for her. Following the prom and her year of obsession, she spent 2 entire years in a rehabilitation institute. I expected her parents to blame me, and instead they thanked me for how I handled the situation and kept me up to date with her progress. After a year, I moved schools to a different state and they would write me occasionally. Eventually, they let me know that Billy had been released and asked if I would be willing to receive a letter from her, and they told me they understood if the answer was no, but I decided to say yes. It was a single sheet containing a single paragraph, and I still have that letter to this day, and I can type it verbatim. It said, "Thank you. Thank you for not taking advantage of me. I'm sorry I pushed you so far, and I'm better now. I'm going to college in the fall, and I'm going to study world history, and I will make you proud, sir. Billy." I don't know what kind of life she's living now. I hope it's her best life, and I hope she recovered from whatever caused her behavior. But I know one thing. As I near retirement, Billy taught me as many lessons as I've taught all my students over the years, and I still refuse to be alone in a classroom with anyone who isn't a colleague. I don't think Alex Crowley was his real name, but that's what he went by, and that's what we called him. I didn't know him at first, not personally anyway. He was a sophomore when I was a freshman. I was a grungy skater kid in the late 90s, into Real Big Fish and Green Day and Sublime and a bit of Nirvana and Pearl Jam. I know, both. And I felt kind of like a badass poser because I was into Failure, a band most of my friends didn't even know, and even more badass, I was an American fan of Jesus and Mary Chain. I'd found Darklands and Automatic in an indie record store, and I'd fallen in love with both LPs. I was a bit of a musical snob is what I mean, despite being a 90s skater kid who could do a bit of grinding and a few ollies and landed a 180 spin about once, but mostly just made bailing videos with my buddy. We were the skaters, the losers, the punks, and we loved it. And our heroes, our absolute idols in high school, were the trenchcoat goths in the year above us. Their leader was a fellow called Alex Crowley, and he claimed to be a direct descendant of famed occultist, mountaineer, ceremonial magician, and founder of the religion of Thelema, Aleister Crowley. But of course he couldn't prove that because Aleister Crowley had so many illegitimate descendants that if you were one of them, you just knew. I suppose maybe that was true, but I'm pretty sure neither of Alex's parents were secret descendants of Aleister Crowley either, and I'm pretty sure the guy ate poop too, so I'm not sure that I'd brag about being related to him personally. Now, I remember when Alex and his crew first approached us as we were sort of skating around. They just stood there in their trench coats, staring and scowling, and there were 4 of them: Alex, Ashley, Jack, and Felicity, the only girl in the group who I had the biggest, maddest crush on and who drove me absolutely wild in her low-cut corsets and goth makeup. Now, she was actually nice too, unlike the others. Jack in particular was a thug, and I'm pretty sure he liked to hurt animals, but I won't dwell on that too much. Alex and Flick are the key players here that you'll have to remember, as well as me, Frankie, and my twin sister Kimmy, who were part of the skate crew. Now, this is how things would play out for about a week. Our group would just nonchalantly skate around on the steps outside the high school, and Alex's group, who I later found out he nicknamed the Sons of Joseph, would just stand there watching us, kind of sneering. And then one weekend we were hanging out at the skate park when we saw the Sons of Joseph come stalking in. One of the skaters yelled insults and derogatory terms at them, and they weren't exactly seen as the cool people by the older guys. But Alex and co gave us as good as they got, and we were enamored. I was even more enamored when I saw Flick walk over to us. Was she gonna speak to me? Oh my god. Well, no. Actually, she spoke to Kimmy and told her that she was a whiz on the skateboard. And later that night, I told Kimmy how jealous I was, and she would not let me live it down. However, being a good sister, she told me that Flick had invited her to the mall tomorrow and maybe I could tag along. Hell yes, of course I would. And so Kimmy and I got there, and we didn't tell the other guys, and I was a little disappointed to discover that Alex, Jack, and Ashley were there too. Well, I didn't have to worry about Jack for long. He got into a fight with a security guard and he got thrown out of the mall, and Alex said that he was done with that prick. He was a liability and he didn't understand the ways, and maybe Kimmy and I would like to take Jack's place in the Sons of Joseph. Now, one look from Flick's bright, mascaraed eyes, and I was nodding like some puppy dog. Kimmy was a little bit more sensible and asked what the sons of Joseph actually meant. I remember Alex tapping his nose and said that was something we'd discover in time. Sure, whatever, Kimmy said. And Alex replied saying that he'd hoped we'd brought money because we'd need whole new wardrobes to join their crew. I'm not ashamed to say that Kimmy and I came from a pretty wealthy family, and Kimmy was trusted with Dad's credit card. Not me, though. He knew that I'd wasted on probably video games, and she was pretty certain that spending the money on clothes would please our parents, so Alex, Ashley, and Flick led us to a hot topic. My outfit was a trench coat, a Misfits t-shirt, and a pair of leather pants that squeaked when I walked. Now, I wasn't so sure about this, but Alex promised me the squeaking would eventually wear off, and I thought about buying some cool boots, but they convinced me that my purple and black skater DCs looked kinda dope with the goth outfit. Kimmy, meanwhile, got dressed out by Flick, and I gotta say, it was extremely disconcerting to see my sister in fishnets, a miniskirt, and a mesh top with her bra visible beneath. In fact, I actually tried to persuade her that our parents really wouldn't approve of that. And she kinda listened and bought a second outfit that was more like a velour dress and made her look like a vampire, and I suppose that was pretty cool. Now, I could tell that Alex had eyes for Kimmy, and I wasn't sure how I felt about that. I wasn't sure how I felt about him at all, now that I'd spent an afternoon with him. He talked and talked and talked, and he talked about his connection to Aleister Crowley and thalamic magic and crap like that. Ashley brought up the Satanic Bible, and Alex laughed. I kid you not, for 5 minutes straight in the food court of KFC before declaring that Anton LaVey was a fraud who wouldn't know true Satanism if it bit him in the ass. I figured now wasn't the best time to tell them that Kimmy and I were Christians, so we just nodded along. I did do some reading about thalamic lore and the Order of Thelema and things like that over the next few months because I'm nothing if not academically curious. It amused me to discover that Alex was basically just making up crap. None of the garbage he spewed was accurate at all, and even though by then I'd already realized that he was a complete charlatan, it was nice to have something to laugh with Kimmy about. Speaking of Kimmy, Alex was constantly, relentlessly trying to get into her pants. Kimmy could hold her own and had obviously no interest in letting Alex take her virginity, but it still made me defensive. He was a creep and a weirdo, and not only that, he was always claiming to hear voices from his true father. He could never decide whether his true father was Aleister Crowley or Satan himself, and in his head I think that they were sort of interchangeable. One of the messages he mysteriously received was that Kimmy should engage in thalamic intimate magic with him, and when she flat out refused, he said that dancing naked for him with sigils drawn on her body would be enough. Kimmy stopped hanging out with him after that. Too exhausting, she said, and she begged me to ditch them too, but at this point, I'd kind of abandoned all my other friends. But to make matters worse, I was deeply, hopelessly head over heels in love with Flick, and it wasn't unrequited either. We were a couple, but we had to keep it a secret from Alex because according to him, the sons of Joseph, male or female, must only lay with him and nobody else. Ashley had ditched the group by this time too and started hanging out with the chess club. We had a new member, and by the name of Norbit, I'm being serious, a nerdy kid whose presence I couldn't even begin to explain. And so the only way for me and Flick to be together was to pretend to tolerate Alex. Any attempt that we made to ditch him resulted in him mysteriously appearing or showing up at my house, which was even worse because I didn't want him anywhere near my sister. Things would have been fine, I think, if Alex hadn't suddenly had an influx of hormones and decided that his true father was sending him messages that we all needed to obey. Suddenly, Norbert's presence made sense. He was a member of the AV club, and Alex's dark father had instructed him to rig a video camera hidden in the vents in the female changing rooms so we could corrupt the fairer sex in the name of Satan without them even knowing. Of course, Flick and I were horrified by this, and Kimmy wanted to kill Alex as soon as I told her, but simply talking about something wasn't a crime. We needed proof that he was actually planning on doing it. He gave Norbit a list of times for the recordings. I stole a copy, and surprise, surprise, they were all times when Kimmy would be coming out of the gym or out of the pool, and this creep was basically planning to stalk my sister by filming her naked. I took Norbit to one side and Flick, and I told him in no uncertain terms that if he went ahead with his plan, we would not only ruin him and his entire high school career, but there was a good chance we'd end his life too. This dumb freshman, I was a sophomore at this point, Flick was a junior, fell for it, and I guess took it so seriously that he changed schools within the month. When it became clear to Alex that his plan to film the girls' locker room had failed, he flew into a rage. He slammed me up against the wall of the AV room, which we now had the keys to thanks to Norbert, and told me that this wasn't going to happen, and that I was going to have to be the one to film Kimmy. I'd be able to do it at home easily, and his true father, the Dark Lord, would bestow upon me untold riches. I told him where he could shove his untold riches, and if he came anywhere near us again, he'd wish he'd never been born. Finally, myself, Kimmy, and Flick were free. Flick and I were able to date openly now, and Kimmy didn't have to worry about this creep trying to, well, creep on her. Or so we thought. As one night Kimmy, Flick, and I were hanging out in Kimmy's bedroom playing 3-player GoldenEye deathmatch, and suddenly, a red light kept glaring on the screen. Initially, Kimmy jokingly blamed one of us, saying that we were trying to put her off with a laser pointer. But then, the red light quickly disappeared, and we heard some scuffling and banging outside. I ran to the window to see this trench coat figure fleeing into the night. It was obviously Alex. He'd been testing to see if he could film Kimmy himself through her bedroom window. Flick had the dumbest yet funniest idea. Using our brand new color printer, we printed out a huge image of a fat man's ass and taped it on the window, and then we waited for Alex to come back that night, which we knew he would, and we heard him out there. He was hardly subtle. Kimmy yelled that she was going to take a shower, and we gave it 10 minutes, and then we pulled the blinds open, revealing the large printout of that ass. And I guess Alex had been filming because we heard this sort of strangled shriek and then the clattering of something falling to the floor, and saw that a trench-coated figure was running away again. When we went out there, the school's camcorder lay abandoned in the flower bed. We watched through the tape. It turned out he'd filmed Kimmy more than he thought. We were all watching when she snatched the videotape away from us and watched the next few minutes alone, and her face went pale. "Just underwear," she said. "But I feel sick." Kimmy didn't tell us anything else. Neither of us asked either. But a few days later, Alex was found with both of his legs broken, apparently by a baseball bat, and he claimed that he'd been jumped by a gang of black guys. When we asked Kimmy if she had planned to pursue the video any further, she just said no. I don't want to say that my sister kneecapped a goth stalker while in high school, but let's just say, years later, and even though you passed away 6 years ago, I'll always be proud of you, Kimmy. My high school years took place in the mid-2000s. I'm a female, and for most of my high school career, probably until senior year, my entire friend group was made up of girls and one single guy, called Guy, who was probably the gayest fellow you could ever meet. We all had this weird thing where we decided that none of us were going to date during high school, and this completely went out of the way during senior year when, I guess, hormones just became too much, but as far as I know, most of us stuck to it. Sure, we snuck a kiss at a party here and there, and I'm not saying that we were prude little good girls, but we had this pact with each other that we were just going to focus on our studies. And that's why we were so shocked when one of our girlies, perhaps the most straight-laced, accidentally let slip that she had a mother-effing sugar daddy. We grilled our friend Samantha within an inch of her life. What had he bought you? Shoes, clothes, jewelry? She had it all to display. Was she physical with him? Of course, very much so. She was sorry that she'd broken the pact, but Mr. X might be the one, and she didn't want to let that slip through her fingers, not when he was so much older than her. Of course, that was scandalous by itself and led to another round of questioning. How old was he? Mid-40s? Was he married? And Samantha shyly admitted that yes, he was. Married with kids. Did we know this guy? Samantha said no, but her hesitation in her eyes, they said yes. It was a man in his 40s with kids that we knew. Now, we pretended to let it drop. We lied and said we were happy for her. Of course, we were all pretty disgusted that our 16-year-old friend was being taken advantage of by a 45-year-old man who was clearly lying about leaving his wife for her and keeping her sweet by giving her some fairly gaudy stuff. I don't know much about sugar daddies, but honestly, I would have expected a little more from the gifts. She said he took her out to dinner too and stayed in some nice hotels, but still. So we pretended to drop it, and instead, we all secretly spied on Samantha individually. I know it sounds awful, but I'll stand by it. We didn't want our friend being seduced by some dirty old man. And there was one guy whose name kept coming up, Mr. Kurswell, one of the science teachers. Samantha would often meet with him after class, and while we couldn't spy for too long, it was absolutely the only lead we had. So Mr. Kurswell became our target, and there was definitely something off about him. He'd sneak phone calls into hidden corners during lunch break. If he was using his laptop when class started, he'd often slam it closed and make sure that we weren't looking before he opened it again. There was something very off about this guy, and we became more and more convinced that this balding, bespectacled biology teacher was the one boinking our buddy. But the question was, what next? That's when Guy had this bright idea of trying to follow Mr. Kurswell one weekend. We had no idea where he'd go or when he'd go, but we decided to time it for a Saturday where Samantha had also refrained from hanging out and heavily claimed that she had a hot date with her mystery sugar daddy. If it was Kurswell, then boom, we were in luck. If not, maybe we'd catch sight of the real culprit. And so we all loaded into Guy's car, and apparently, as subtle as a cop tailing a suspect, we followed Samantha for nearly an hour and found ourselves in the next town over. It was one of those little towns that you kind of look down on. Jokes about the folks there being inbred and the fact that there was a weird smell. A cellophane factory explained that, and just kind of overall crappy. Not exactly the place that you'd expect a hot date with a sugar daddy. Samantha headed into this crappy mall, and we followed at a pretty long distance, and it became clear pretty quickly that she was checking out some stores. There were 4 of us without Samantha, so we decided that it didn't make sense for the entire group to tail her. We'd be spotted in an instant. And she was headed mostly into these girly stores, so despite her penchant for glitter and pink, we figured Guy should hang back. It was decided that I was the most nondescript and unnoticeable. Not sure if that was a compliment, but it worked well enough here. And so I followed Samantha into a bunch of stores, and what I saw shocked me. The gifts her sugar daddy had been bestowing on her, she was shoplifting them. I followed her into 4 stores and watched as she stole costume jewelry, lingerie, a crop top, and all sorts of crap. Not once did she get spotted by security either. I hightailed it out of there. I didn't want to get wrapped up in all of that, and I didn't want to look complicit. And so I met my friends at the agreed point, a sort of hidden area where we weren't in much danger of being spotted by Samantha. I was all ready to hit them with my revelation, but I didn't have a chance. They were the ones who hit me with the gossip. We were right. Our science teacher, Mr. Kurswell, was here in the same mall as Samantha, and what more proof did we need? I waited until they finished chattering and then told them what I'd observed. There was no sugar daddy offering gifts. Samantha was a kleptomaniac. Presumably she'd traveled to the next town over because the local mall security were getting suspicious in our town. And so everyone was absolutely baffled. They definitely seen Kurswell, and he definitely seemed sketchy. And at the same mall as Samantha, too. Could it be possible that they were having a fling, but the gifts were stolen for our benefit to try and justify all of it? Or had we been stalking our friend for literally no reason? It didn't make any sense. Why would Kurswell be at this mall? Now, it was over an hour outside of town, and our local mall was 1,000 times better. All we could do was head out and plan to head home, but first we decided to stop by the food court to grab some macas. And that's when we saw him. Mr. Kurswell sat at a goddamn McDonald's 2-seater holding hands with someone who was not his wife. And it wasn't Samantha, though, either. Mr. Kurswell and the man whose hand he held both turned to us. The unknown man looked puzzled. Mr. Kurswell looked sick. He stood up and immediately began pleading for us to come over. Now, let's get this straight. If we hadn't suspected Kurswell of being Samantha's sugar daddy, we would have gone on liking the dude. He was one of our favorite teachers, in fact. And now, he looked close to tears. The idea of him having an affair, even if it was to hide the truth of his identity, kind of made me feel sick, and the first thing I thought was, his poor wife. But then he called it over and explained everything. His wife knew. She too was of the same kind of proclivities as he was. She'd also always wanted kids, which were indeed his, and they both loved their kids very much. And they loved each other too, but in their own little way. But this whole business had begun years ago, before homosexuality was quite so acceptable, and the whole deal that they had with the kids and an unusual marriage, it had been a long-term lie that they just didn't want to have to explain to friends and family. He said that we could call his wife if we wanted. He said that he knew we were good kids, and he said that he was sure that some of us understood, looking pointedly at Guy at this point. And that's how the stalking of our best friend and our science teacher led us to helping him and his wife cover up their conventional marriage. We provided alibis and we did all sorts of things. And we also kind of cut Samantha off after we tried our best to talk her out of being a klepto. She refused and also saw no problem with the sugar daddy lie. We didn't tell her anything about Kurtzwell, but we did tell her that we'd had a suspect and she didn't seem to care about their well-being. It just made us realize that people are never who they seem to be or who you expect them to be. And as a funny aside, Guy, who is the campiest, gayest man I've ever met, eventually realized that he was just as into women as he was into men, and now he's one of the biggest players, in a nice way, that I've ever met. Mr. Kurtzwell still lives with his wife, and their kids have gone off to college now, and they're considering finally living their true lives. Their kids know the truth and have done so for many years, but ultimately, it's whatever makes them happy. All I'm glad is that our one little jaunt into stalking didn't lead to the ruination of multiple lives. But I'll tell you what, from now on, I've decided that unless it seems like someone's in danger, nothing is my business to get involved in. It was my idea to put on a horror production. We were the alternative theater kids. We begged the drama teacher to let a bunch of us do our own thing, and instead of yet another performance of West Side Story or Grease, all our bitching worked, and eventually Mrs. J relented. Now, my friend Kirsten wrote the script. It was a slasher play rife with squibs and blood and fake ghosts, and low on plot, really. Nobody was going to attend expecting to see Waiting for Godot, though. They wanted blood, guts, and one shocking scene, boobs. Now don't worry, we used prosthetics. None of us were getting our boobs out for a goddamn school play. Plus, we didn't want to get expelled, obviously. We practiced that play for God knows how many times, and at that stage we knew it off by heart. But something we'd never done is perform it at night. And that's when it would be debuting as a horror play, so, of course, we begged and pleaded with Mrs. J to let us start one final rehearsal at 8 p.m. It took some cajoling, but she relented. The grumpy, scary janitor even agreed to stay late to keep an eye on us so we didn't break his crap. Now, we were all excited. There were 8 of us in total, 6 players, the director, myself, and the lighting and sound guy. I won't list all 8 names because you'll forget them all, but the 4 important ones are me, Ayla, Victor as an actor, Judd as an actor who plays the killer, and Clyde as an actor, the tragic hero. And so we ran through the first scene where a few of the characters are playing spin the bottle in a cabin in the woods. The bottle stops 5 times, creating the shape of a pentagram, and a visual effect causes a mysterious puff of smoke to leave the bottle. Dead impressive. Of course, all the characters decide that it's the ghosts of Rancid Jack, a serial killer who stalked those woods 100 years ago. And of course it is. So the rest of the play continues with the characters getting picked off by Rancid Jack one by one, until only Vicky, the virgin final girl, and Clyde, the boyfriend, are left. After we ran through the first scene, 2 of the actors went outside for a smoke break, and they never returned. It didn't matter too much, we just decided to mess around tweaking some of the practical effects. The sound guy did a bunch of improvements too, and I really think we had something special on our hands. To this day, I swear that if we'd actually got to perform this damn play, it would have gone down in our high school history, and not just because of the prosthetic bloody boobs. Now, eventually, we needed our 2 missing actors, so the other actor, Layla, went to look for them. She didn't return either, but we did hear a scream. This caused Judd and Clyde to go running out into the barely lit corridor. Me and Vicky stayed behind like the nervous girls we were, and of course Denny, the sound guy, had to stay and protect us. Now, this was his excuse anyway. Eventually, Clyde and Judd returned, looking pale and terrified. There'd been no sign of any of the missing three, except for a bucket load of blood. Some of it was outside and some of it was in the corridor. Now, of course, we all started freaking out. The only person in the building who wasn't accounted for was the freaky janitor, Mr. Williams. All sorts of rumors circulated about this guy. He was an ex-con, he'd spent time inside for killing a man in a bar fight, and he'd fought in Vietnam and had the highest kill count in his unit. He had a tin of Viet Cong teeth in his little basement office. One student swore blind that they'd seen it before Williams had chased him off. Now, there was no doubt in my mind, freaked out by constant horror play rehearsals and the alleged blood, that this janitor had killed our friends. Maybe he'd watched the play and it had triggered the Nam flashbacks. Who knew? Denny and Vicky and Judd volunteered to go get help, which, thinking back now, was kind of an odd group. Why 3 of them? All I knew was that this left me with Clyde, my IRL boyfriend, and I wasn't going to argue against holding up with him. Now, we hid in the sound booth and listened in horror as we heard running footsteps and screams and even pleas for help. All 3 of our friends had met grisly fates, we thought, and that just left us. We had no choice but to try and escape the building and call the cops. Clyde grabbed a heavy metal bar and we made our way into the corridors, and if there had been blood there before, it was gone now. Williams must have cleaned it up, and there was no sign of the bodies either. I was crying, begging Clyde to protect me, begging him not to let me die. And then, up ahead of us, the door to the maintenance area burst open. The janitor stood there, some pole held in his hand, and a look of fury on his face. He yelled, asking what the hell we thought we were doing. Clyde didn't even think to stop. He charged Williams with a metal pipe and cracked him in the skull, and this sent him collapsing to the ground, and then Clyde went to town hammering the guy's legs so he couldn't come after us. And between the grunts, he told me that he didn't want to kill him, that he had to face justice, but he had to make sure the guy never walked again and couldn't come after us. And by the time he was done, Williams' right leg was a bloody pulp, and the left had visible bone fractures in 3 places. Williams was trying to say something. Blood was bubbling out of his mouth, but Clyde kicked him in the side. Then the door burst open, and the rest of the cast yelled, "Surprise!" The cry died on their lips as they saw Williams lying on the floor, Clyde standing over him with a bloody dripping pipe like a madman, and the whole thing had been an idiotic, ill-fated prank. Everyone was in on it except for myself and Clyde, and Mr. Williams apparently. The prank ruined all of our lives. Despite thinking he was protecting his girlfriend from a stalker, Clyde faced charges when Williams, quite understandably, demanded that the full weight of the law come down upon him. And due to the extenuating circumstances, he only spent a couple of years in juvie, but it still ruined his life. The others had to live with the guilt of what they caused. They were all expelled, of course, and more than one of them ended up taking a dark path through life. And from what I know, at least one of them has ended their life over that guilt. As for me, I don't know that I'll ever get over it. Seeing Clyde defend me like that only to mutilate an innocent man, and even then I can't convince myself that there wasn't a serial killer trying to take us all out that night. My head is a mess. I've been in and out of institutes, and my latest therapist recommended that I blog about my teenage drama. I don't know if sending my story into Let's Read is the best, most cathartic idea. I know many of your audience will tell me I'm a terrible person and that we all deserve what we got. Maybe that's what I need to hear. Maybe I need to accept that we all jumped the gun and acted like fucking retards. I know we did. I guess I just need to self-flagellate, and I'm hoping that the Let's Read audience will finally either help me move on or help me blame myself enough to make a final decision. All I want to say is, Mr. Williams, if you happen to hear this from heaven or wherever you are right now, I'm sorry. You didn't deserve any of that, and you weren't a stalker, and I'm sorry my boyfriend crippled you. Hey, Dark Somnium. I'm a YouTuber just like you. Not quite as big, sadly. I've only got a few thousand subscribers since 2012, but I'm getting there. I got some plans for the next year that should bring me into the big time. I'd love to pick your brain for some help in getting bigger, actually, and if you got the time one day, email me at drinkthepiss@gmail.com anytime you want to chat, and would be really appreciated. Now, I'm not just emailing you trying to collaborate, though, I promise. I have a quick, scary story that I want to share with you and your lovely audience. Please subscribe to me on my channel, by the way. And so my channel is, I've kind of hit a brick wall. I hit a few thousand subscribers back in the 2010s when stupid Call of Duty videos and YouTube poops were popular, and I've never really grown since then. People don't care about goofy COD videos anymore, it seems, or baked memes, and it makes me sad. Anyway, that's not the point. The point is, I was a high schooler when I got big on YouTube. As you know, being an old man veteran, a few thousand subs was a big deal back in 2013, before the likes of my heroes like Leafy and iDubbbz, not to mention the main man Charlie and that Hassan Piker the Twitch streamer. And the way I figure it, when you factor in inflation, 3,000 subs in 2013 is about the same as 10 million now, give or take. And so, when some kids at my school discovered that I was a YouTuber with what they saw was a crazy amount of subs, I became something of a celebrity. They uncovered my double life because I made the mistake of watching my own content on the library computers, and they saw what I was up to. Oh well, I thought. I kind of expected that I'd just become a minor celebrity in sixth form, as I went to one of the UK schools that includes sixth form as part of the school itself, and yeah, I guess that happened. Now what I didn't foresee, though, was Rick. Rick was in the year below me, so AS level, and he was a film studies student. When he discovered I was a successful YouTuber, he went kinda nuts. It took him a few days to gather the courage to approach me, but when he did that day in the cafeteria, there was no stopping him. Rick talked. A lot. He had all these ideas for my YouTube channel. Ideas that even I, as a forward-thinking and imaginative individual, could clearly tell were too ambitious. Now, I was out there making COD fail videos, SpongeBob memes, and Counter-Strike parkour videos while talking about the latest online drama. Rick basically wanted us to make a goddamn feature film. I wouldn't have minded so much about Rick sitting at the cafeteria table with me every free period. Nobody else really did, and they were a bit intimidated by me being a big YouTuber, except for the fact that Rick stunk. And now, excuse my language, but he smelled like Jason Momoa's armpit hair. In the end, my nasal cavities couldn't put up with Rick's stink anymore, so I told him that I just wasn't interested in his stupid video ideas. And I could see the tears welling up in this kid's eyes as I told him the home truths he needed to hear, and I thought that'd be the end of it. But no. I kept finding notes in the common room, the cafeteria, and all of my classrooms pinned to the notice board and the whiteboard. Sometimes they'd just say, "Make videos with me, please, Rick." And other times they'd be an entire page describing some idea about an entire zombie movie that he wanted us to film and release on my YouTube channel. And the more I found the notes, the more Rick kept bragging about how his YouTube channel was growing. So in the end, I looked up the channel name that he'd given me, Ricky Dicky Davy, it's thankfully gone now, and saw that the chode had 8 subscribers. Effing heck, mate. I subscribe anyway, out of pity. Big mistake, I think, and this inspired Rick to start posting. A lot. But he didn't just post the usual YTPs or takedowns of Pokemon or Content Cop or elephants pooping at the zoo. No. Every video he posted was a clip of behind the scenes of a famous YouTuber. He didn't say a famous YouTuber. He said my username, but I don't want to do too much self-promotion here. It was crazy. The dude had been filming me all around college, from a distance, eating alone in a cafe, hanging out on the quad smoking a cigarette, playing squash in the gym, coming out of the changing rooms all sweaty. And I kid you not, he filmed me in the changing rooms, not naked thankfully, but titled, "Famous YouTuber Works Hard for His Fans." Now, I could immediately tell this was stalking, pure and simple. Now, I'd had enough of this Rick guy. I found him spying on me one day and took his digital camera and smashed it to pieces on the ground. I slammed him up against a wall and told him that if he ever filmed me ever again, if I ever saw him on my channel again, I would ruin his life with all of the power of a certain Chan-based message board who I had a good relationship with thanks to my videos. I thought Rick got the message. I got an in-school suspension for fighting, but it was worth it. Rick left the school at the end of the term, but not before telling me he'd get even with me. I thought nothing more of the confused little prick for 3 years. He never uploaded again, and I went off to college and continued my career. Things weren't great. I struggled to make friends and then hit rock bottom when my girlfriend left me, and I'd never know what true suffering was like until then. I became a bit of a shut-in for a while, but eventually got over it and became a party animal. filming it all, of course. And speaking of filming, there was one final twist in the tale. One day, I get an alert on YouTube saying that Ricky Dicky Davy has uploaded, and so I click the video out of morbid curiosity. It's a series of videos, in fact. A series of videos taken on a handheld camera filming a house at night from outside. My house. My shared house at college. Somehow Rick had tracked me down. I watched in horror as he just filmed me through my living room doing my stretches and exercises and playing the PlayStation. And that was all. Just hours and hours of footage of me doing nothing. The video ended with a movie maker text saying, "This is the price of fame." Then Rick walked back towards the camera, showing a steaming turd on my driveway. A turd that I remembered picking up that morning and believing it to belong to the dog next door. Ricky Ticky Davy's channel is now gone. Mine's still up, and again, I'd really appreciate a shout out to the channel if you read the story. But even though I only have a few thousand followers and I've moved twice since the events of this story, I still live in fear that one day, Stinky Rick will find me and make me the subject of his new video, and this time, it'll be a snuff film. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over to my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks and bonus content from members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. And I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. Please go subscribe. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, trail mix is human kibble. Narrated to me by my grandmother about 20 years ago now. We were given a middle school assignment to ask an elderly person to tell us a story and then write it up, and so I hit my grandma up thinking that she'd share some cheerful tale of her youth. And instead, the story she told me was one of the most effed up things I've ever heard. I got a fantastic grade for it though, so thanks for that, Grandma. But anyway, she was just over 70 when she told me the following tale, and she's still around at 90, and she's not quite so communicative these days, but chatty and coherent enough that she gave me permission to send it to my favorite scary stories YouTuber once I explained to her who you are and what you do. And so the following story is written from the perspective of my grandma, Carol, and well, prepare yourself for one of the most screwed up stories I've personally ever heard. My name's Carol. I grew up in a very small town out near Rochester, Minnesota called Plainview. It was a very quiet place, right in the middle of a farm country, and back in the 40s, maybe only 1,000 or so people called it home. We'd swim in the creek during summer break and then sled down hills in the winter, but all year round, Sundays were special. Come Sunday, everyone in town went to church, and then afterwards it was home for potluck dinners with neighbors who helped each other when things got tough. Budget running a little thin? People'd pitch in and leave a blank envelope of cash in your mailbox. Barn burned down after a lightning strike? Folks would show up with hammers and food. I remember that. I learned to work hard and love my neighbors, and of all of our neighbors, no one was loved quite as much as Edith Olson. From what I remember of her, she was the kind of woman who could make you feel warm, even on the coldest of winter days. She was graceful, tall and pretty, with light brown hair and a big smile that always carried to her shining blue eyes. She was a God-fearing woman, too, and every Sunday you'd see her standing out front of the Lutheran church with an old, near-worn-out Bible that she was oh so very proud of. But life hadn't been easy for Edith. Back in the 30s, when I was still a little kid, Edith's husband, Lars, had a terrible accident at home. Word has it that he was up on top of the barn fixing roof shingles after a big storm when he suddenly slipped and fell to his death. His sudden passing left her a widow at just 38 years old and with a young daughter to raise too. Little Ruth Olson was still being breastfed when her father died, and when he passed, the whole town descended on Edith's home to help take care of her and the baby, not with the breastfeeding though, I'd imagine. Now, despite her being half an orphan, it seemed like little Ruth had a bright future ahead of her, as a little girl who had a very special place in everyone's heart. But then, when she was just a couple of years old, little Ruth got sick, really sick, and she never quite recovered. Now, by age 5, it was clear that she wouldn't grow up the same as other children and would most likely be confined to a wheelchair. She was also clear that she'd have to live on a cocktail of medications in order to keep her various conditions in check, all of which were down to the illness she suffered within her infancy. God was challenging her in a big way, but Edith never complained. She'd always say, "The Lord provides, and so do good neighbors," and wasn't that just the truth? The wheelchair, the medicines, and all the home modifications Edith needed didn't come cheap, and so to pay for it, Edith put on bake sales down at the church or set up tables outside the hardware store covered in pies and cookies. Now, I've had many a happy memory of walking past Edith's pop-up stalls, but as I came to learn, it wasn't all her work. About 90% of it was baked by other people who happily donated their goods for Edith to profit from. Thanks to her husband's life insurance, she didn't even really need the money either. It was just extra to make sure that little Ruth had the most comfortable life possible. And besides, someone who'd been through that much in their life needed to keep their hands busy, lest the devil make work for them, as the saying goes. For years, Edith was the recipient of endless charity, like in the wintertime when Ruth's medication was paid for by the Christmas quilt raffle down at the town hall, as well as the 50-cent hot dish suppers after church services. And things stayed like that for years and years and years, because Edith, and little Ruthie by extension, they were like the town's talismans. Despite all Edith had been through, she still kept a smile on her face and she still praised God. But as Ruth got older, her condition got worse. I remember there was a time when no one saw her for a while, and then when Ruth re-emerged, she was completely mute and immobile, being pushed around in her chair by her mom. And it was so sad to see because before, Ruth had been able to move her arms and hands to complete simple tasks, and had even been able to get a few words out here and there. People assumed that she was dumb, but she wasn't. She just couldn't express herself very well. But then, by the time she was maybe 13 to 14, Ruth could barely even move her eyes anymore. Edith would push her around the grocery store asking her questions, but getting no answers, and it tore people up inside to see it getting to her. Once again, they rallied to her cause and helped put a smile back on the face of a woman that had so often made themselves smile. But then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse for poor Edith, they somehow did. Now, like I said, Edith was well taken care of by her neighbors, so much so that when a strange man was noticed to be parked outside her house for a few hours, one of them moseyed on over to ask him his business. The man was very rude in response, so rude in fact that Edith's neighbor decided to call the Washita County Sheriff's Department to report him. The sheriff sent out one of his deputies who told the guy to move along before he got himself arrested for loitering or some such offense. The guy made tracks after grumbling something about being an honest citizen, but then a couple of days later, he showed up again, and that time, he was banging on Edith's door. Once again, the sheriff is called, and once again a deputy heads over to tell the guy to move on. It turns out Edith was cowering inside with little Ruthie, who explained that she'd met the man after answering a personals ad for lonely widows. She'd spoken to him on the phone a few times, decided that she didn't want to date, and then tried to break things off, but the man didn't take it well. Not at all. She had him charged with trespassing on the property, and he was warned that if he showed up in town again, he'd spend the night in jail. But apparently that didn't deter Edith's spurned telephone companion. Not even a week after the man had trespassed, he was caught sneaking up Edith's driveway in the middle of the night by a man letting his dog out front to use the bathroom. The cops were called for a third time, but instead of fleeing once he'd been spotted, the man continued his attempt to break into Edith's home. When the deputies arrived, the sheriff himself was with them, and as promised, Edith's ex, if you can even call it that, was immediately taken to jail. I heard he left town the next morning with a black eye and a busted lip, all the result of his uncooperative attitude while in custody. And that was the official story anyway. The unofficial one, as in the truth, circulated much slower. While in custody, the sheriff wanted to know why Edith's ex couldn't take no for an answer, and so he asked him. And when he did, what came out of the stranger's mouth made the sheriff so furious that he beat the living hell out of him, and he had to be dragged away by his deputies. I don't know if anyone but the sheriff heard exactly what was said, but word had it that the man had made a very serious accusation regarding Edith Olsen and her daughter Ruth. One so foul and disgusting that not only did he refuse to repeat it, but the sheriff felt the need to defend Edith's honor with such ferocity. Years went by, and as little Ruth blossomed into a young woman, her conditions only got worse. She became completely catatonic, with Ruth having to bathe her, feed her, and change her diapers. And then whenever she needed to get housework done or cook dinner, Edith would sit Ruth in front of the radio and would tune the dial to whichever station was hosting a radio play. Ruth loved radio theater, and I remember loving them myself around that time too. I used to imagine her listening to Lights Out, The Man Called X, or my personal favorite, The Lone Ranger. I used to enjoy the old reruns of Mail Call and The March of Time too, stuff from back when the war was on, but I imagine Ruth got more of a kick out of Little Orphan Annie than old war stories. But on that point, I could not have been more wrong. One day, Edith was out pushing Ruthie around when they stopped by the post office for some reason. I don't know what the heck Edith was doing in there, something money-related probably, but as she's standing there doing whatever she's doing, a nearby clerk noticed Ruthie was looking right at him. Herb Cooper was a kindly older man, and so he smiled and waved at Ruthie without expecting anything in return. He knew Ruthie could barely move by then, and so imagine his surprise when he noticed her finger tapping on the arm of her wheelchair. Herb said later that he didn't know if she was doing it on purpose or if it was just a reflex thing, but all the same, she's staring right at him as he's leaning on the counter waiting for a customer. But then, old Herb notices something about the way Ruth was tapping, something that had a strange rhythm about it that was instantly familiar to him. She was tapping out 3 quick taps, 3 long taps, and then 3 quick taps again, and then she'd wait, staring right at him, and then do it all over again. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. Herb knew that pattern anywhere because he'd learned it during his time in the military. It was Morse code, the kind that they used to tap out over the wire, and it meant SOS. When Edith wheeled Ruth back out again with a big smile and a cheery goodbye, Herb had to force a fake one. He couldn't quite believe what he'd just seen, even though the evidence of it had been right there in front of him, and when he went home for dinner that night, he told his wife what had happened. It was Mrs. Cooper who told him to search his soul and to go talk to the sheriff if he thought he needed to. Well, Herb did some soul-searching all right, because the very next morning he drove to the sheriff's office and told the sheriff himself what he'd seen at the post office. Herb was as reliable as the rising sun, so coming from him, the sheriff knew to take it seriously and went over to Edith's home to have a talk with her. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is when the proverbial cat was let out of the bag. The sheriff figured something was wrong when Edith refused to let him inside and insisted they walk out on the step for everyone to hear. Now, the sheriff told her what he had to say wasn't something that she wanted people to hear, but Edith insisted, and it took the sheriff promising to return with a warrant for her to step aside from the doorway and invite him in. And while once he was inside, the sheriff caught a glimpse of what was really going on in that house. And let me tell you, it wasn't pretty. Despite keeping the outside of her home spotless, the inside was another story entirely. It was filthy, with moldy food in the refrigerator, dying houseplants standing in vases full of stagnant water, and what could only be described as a stack of Ruth's dirty diapers just piled up in the kitchen. I heard Edith tried explaining it away by saying that she hadn't had time to clean in a couple of days, but somehow she managed to keep her own bedroom clean as a whistle while keeping Ruth's like a damned pigsty. He later said it looked like the poor girl's sheets hadn't been washed in years, and how what had once been bright white cotton was tinged in this faded yellow. Edith continued to make excuses as the sheriff toured her horror show of a home, but the final straw was what passed for her medicine cabinet. Edith claimed that Ruth needed all kinds of medications, including blood thinners, kidney regulators, and all kinds of other stuff like that. But upon looking in her medicine cabinet, the sheriff didn't spot anything of the sort. He wasn't a doctor, of course, but he'd confiscated enough pills for enough pillheads over the years to recognize a tranquilizer when he saw one. He knew Ruth needed sleeping pills too, as she sometimes found it difficult to get her rest at night. But Edith must have had 24 bottles of farm animal-grade tranquilizer in there, the kind of stuff that they give to bulls before they go under the knife for whatever reason, along with a ton of anti-anxiety meds and strong pain medication. There wasn't a single medication meant for any of Ruthie's so-called conditions, only stuff to keep her still and placid while her mom pushed her around in a wheelchair. The sheriff had his suspicions right away, and he couldn't arrest her for child abuse right there and then. Instead, he put her in handcuffs for some kind of narcotics violation for owning regulated medications that she didn't have a prescription for. But then once Edith was in custody, he ordered a full investigation into Ruth's treatment, and that's how the cops discovered that Edith's entire life was little more than a lie. She'd been pretending her daughter was sick ever since she was a baby, and then by the time Ruth was old enough to realize she wasn't sick, Edith needed to ensure her continued compliance, and so she started drugging her. She didn't just drug her daughter either. She beat her, starved her, and psychologically tortured her by telling Ruth that everything, and I mean everything, was her fault. Everything from her father's death to her condition was Ruth's fault, and if she ever tried to escape or alert anyone to what her mother was doing, she'd be killed. And this was all discovered after Ruth was placed in foster care and was being taken care of by people who genuinely cared about her. They fed her to get her strength up and helped her through the withdrawals from all the medication that she was no longer being given. And then slowly but surely, as the drugs cycled out of her system, Ruth began talking again, and she told her story in full. It turns out Edith was telling the truth about the telephone companion who tried breaking into her house. She had met with him after responding to a Lonely Hearts ad, one which claimed to specialize in widows. The man himself was a widower, and apparently she and the stranger had shared something of a budding friendship. But then somehow, and for whatever God-forsaken reason, Edith let slip about the way she treated her daughter. She didn't tell her new companion everything. In fact, it was just one little line that aroused his suspicions. And that line involved her taking great pleasure in punishing little Ruthie for what her mother called her sins of the flesh. I guess with him being a religious man, Edith expected her companion to understand. But just like any other sane person, he questioned how a severely disabled young woman could ever deserve such punishments when she was too weak to talk, let alone walk. Apparently, and under the guise of offering Edith some financial assistance, he asked to come over to check out their living conditions. Edith was all for taking the man's money, but when she'd refused to let him anywhere near the house and said that she'd shoot him if he tried, he naturally grew more and more suspicious. He knew Edith lived in Plainview, he just didn't know where. But all it took was a little ride around town, talking to folks about the town's very own angel in human form to figure out where her house was. After that came the sightings of him, and apparently he was only rude to Edith's neighbor because he believed the whole town was in on Ruth's abuse. She talked at length about this big support network she had and how everyone in town loved her and would do anything for her. And so our telephone companion assumed the whole town was bad, hence why he kept on coming back despite warnings from deputies. He ended up telling the sheriff right to his face that Edith Olsen was subjecting her own daughter to a living nightmare of hellish proportions. But like we already covered, the sheriff had been so well fooled by Edith's act that he beat the living crap out of the guy for even suggesting she was bad. I don't know if the sheriff ever got around to apologizing to this guy, but I guess not, as doing so would be an admission that his injuries weren't the result of a bad fall or bumping his head while they were trying to get him into his cell. But I know he apologized to the people of Plainview for not figuring it all out years ago and saving poor little Ruthie a whole world of suffering. Edith ended up going to jail, and for a heck of a long time, too. So long I heard that she died in prison back in the 80s. And then aside from being set up with a foster family someplace, I'm not sure what happened to poor Ruthie. I hope she's living a good life somewhere with a good family by her side, too. And I hope all the physical and mental wounds have healed, but if they're anything like the psychological wounds suffered by the folks of Plainview, then they took a long, long time to heal. And see, it wasn't just the suspicions that destroyed the social fabric of my hometown. It was the guilt. Folks realized that they didn't really know their neighbors, not in the way that they liked to imagine they did anyway, and that did its own damage. But the guilt, the crushing, inescapable guilt of knowing they'd stood by and done nothing, it destroyed them. People blamed each other, blamed themselves, blamed God for allowing such a nightmare to continue for years and years unabated. And by the time I graduated high school and started looking at colleges to attend, I couldn't wait to get the hell out of town and to some place that didn't have this big, dark cloud hanging over it. I've been back since, and like I said, things finally seem to have changed around town and reverted back to the wholesome, peaceful, and trusting place it used to be. People still tell the story of the evil old witch, Edith Olsen. But to the kids, it's nothing more than a scary story from a different time, something that can affect them or hurt them. But to folks like me, who are old enough to remember all that evil, hatred, and mistrust, it feels as close as yesterday. People are always quite surprised when I tell them, but I used to be in a band. Not just a pub or garage band either, although I've the most utmost respect for working musicians everywhere, but a band that was right on the cusp of being signed. Now, yet right at the moment of truth, something came along and burst our bubble in the most horrifying way imaginable. And long story short, I ended up playing a little acoustic set at this gig during my first year of uni. I got the crowd going with a cover of American Pie, turned it into a bit of a sing-along, and then had a few pints with my guitar case next to me watching the other bands play. One of the groups was a three-piece who covered songs by artists that I liked. Things like Zeppelin, Hendrix, a bit of Dylan, stuff like that. And we got chatting after their set, and they invited me to come and jam with them, and the rest was history. And the three-piece became a four-piece. They really needed someone who could do backing, play rhythm, and essentially play second fiddle to their singer and lead guitarist, Richie. Richie could sing like Robert Plant and shred like Jimmy Page, the kind of frontman that every great rock band needs, and so I was only too happy to be the sort of polish that made him shine kind of thing, and shine he did. The bassist and drummer said that I was like the missing fourth piece of the puzzle. Two lads who, funnily enough, were both named Andy. The Andys, as I started calling them, were both great lads and talented musicians in their own right, but they both agreed that I was a great addition, and I loved them for how welcome they made me feel. Anyway, we started gigging together with a new set list, and one that we were really freaking proud of, too. And then we started kicking down doors all over Sheffield, Manchester, and Leeds at whatever gigs we could get our names on, and very quickly, we started attracting attention. At one gig, we had an A&R guy ask us for a demo, and then it wasn't long before we got a call back from a bloke inviting us down to none other than Columbia Records. Columbia is a huge label, so as you can imagine, getting an invite from them was as flattering as it was exciting. We went down to London for what was basically an audition, and then after sitting down with some bigwig and the A&R guy that we'd met, we were told to basically go away, write 8 songs of our strongest possible material, and then get ready to record them, tour the country, and then release our debut. It was what you'd call a development deal, something record companies do to make sure that you're all but locked into a contract with them before any others get their greedy little mitts on you. But at the time, we were over the moon, and the future looked very bright indeed. But those next few months, my God, they were exhausting. We kept on going to uni, but no one went home for Easter break, and pretty much all of our free time was spent in our practice space writing songs and trying out said songs at various gigs that we were now being sought out to play. It was honestly one of the happiest and most fun-filled times of my entire life. And thanks to the little stipend Columbia paid us, so we had money to write the album, I had real cash in my pocket for the first time in my life. We all did, and it was fantastic. But burning the candles at both ends, jamming all night and then going to uni the next morning, it started to really take its toll on us, but especially Richie. Richie was the driving force of the band, and without a doubt, and although we were all excited about the development deal, etc., Richie seemed literally high on the excitement. He didn't sleep for almost 50-something hours over one weekend because every time he tried to doze off, he kept getting ideas for licks or lyrics that he just had to record or write down. He seemed like he was getting into a real state at one point. Like he seemed all frazzled and scatterbrained from the sleep deficit. It didn't help that we were drinking a lot too, but then one day, Richie met this girl who quickly became his girlfriend, and he was suddenly his old self again. Now we were thinking, oh he's probably sleeping like the dead after rolling around all night with her. But we weren't complaining, not when he basically wrote the entire album in 3 weeks, with our contributions of course, and it was fantastic. But then, not long after the album was accepted by our A&R guy and he started looking for a producer for us, Richie started acting all strange. He'd either be super upbeat and positive or ultra moody and negative, like totally bipolar, and the same could be said for his energy levels. He was either raring to go and full of beans or nodding out in his chair like he hadn't slept in days. It was obvious that he was taking drugs of some kind. We just didn't know which ones, as we were actually very naive and innocent for 4 lads on the verge of being rock stars. We never shared anything stronger than a bottle of Jack Daniels before going on stage together, so imagine our surprise when after staging a little intervention on Richie's behalf, we find out that he'd been juggling both a speed habit and a sleeping pill habit, all in pursuit of getting the album written. Now, it was quite an emotional intervention, really, because we knew that he was only doing it for the benefit of the band. It wasn't like he was out there doing coke and sharing needles in the pursuit of hedonism. He was staying up for days writing music while doing speed to keep him awake, and then taking loads of sleeping pills to put himself down so he didn't have a complete mental breakdown. That stopped for a while, surprisingly effectively, in fact. But then one day, it stopped working, and both his body and mind really started to suffer. He'd kept it a secret from us because he knew that we'd put a stop to it, but he was so completely terrified of losing that development deal, there are loads of clauses in them, time frame being one of them, that he turned to better living through chemistry, as it were. And the point is, we had to get him clean and at least partially sober before we went to sign that deal and cut the record, or Columbia would drop us like a live hand grenade. It wasn't easy. We had to cancel gigs, lie to the A&R guy, and delay our next meeting, and then make sure that Richie didn't relapse or lean too heavy on the booze or the weed. It wasn't pretty either. It got really ugly at times, but in the end, Richie emerged clean, sober, and ready to fulfill what I firmly believe was his destiny. We arranged that second meeting down in London, got ready to show off what we'd put together then, and then off we went. Just not as a group. For reasons I can't quite remember now, only me and Andy the bassist were getting the train together. Richie was getting a later train with his girlfriend who had to work, while Andy the drummer was going to drive down to London early the next morning as he had to give drum lessons and didn't want to cancel. It's also worth noting that Andy the drummer had recently broken up with his girlfriend, Laura, and while he was a bit down about it, it in no way looked like it was going to compromise the deal, so no one was worried. Now anyway, me and Andy got to our hotel and then spent all night chatting because we were so excited. We showed up at Columbia right and early the next morning, and at first, we're the only ones there. This didn't bother me at first, as we'd arrived early like I said, but then as the minutes rolled on and there was no sign of Richie, me and Andy, the bassist, started to worry. Now we're thinking, he wouldn't relapse and mess this whole thing up the night before, would he? And while we wanted to say no, there was this real sense of, actually, we don't know. And that was a pretty horrible feeling, let me tell you. Imagine our whole future falling apart right there before our eyes, but then just as I was starting to really despair, who should show up but Richie? I don't think I'd ever been so relieved or pleased to see him, and we both gave him and his girlfriend big hugs when they got out of the taxi right there in front of us. But then after the hugs and the smiles and the thank God you're here, Richie asks, "Where's Andy?" And it was only then that we realized that no one had spoken to him. It was one of those, I thought you texted him. No, I thought you texted him kind of situations. But no one had. No one had called him either, but we still weren't worried at first because Andy the drummer was always Mr. Reliable. And that's half the reason they had him as the drummer in the first place, before I joined the band, I mean, because without a drummer, you pretty much got nothing. If your bassist doesn't turn up, you can get by with just a guitar and drums. Look at the white stripes and the black keys. You could even do an instrumental set if your singer doesn't turn up and get the audience to do the singing. And with the rest of the set list, that works surprisingly well. But if your drummer doesn't turn up, you're buggered. And since Andy the drummer always bloody turned up, we had absolute faith that he was going to show up, and it was simply running a little bit late. But then, despite all three of us calling him in turn, Andy picked up his phone. In fact, when he gave it a second round of calls just minutes after, someone had switched it off. We waited 5 minutes, and then 15, and then we had to go inside or risk being late for the meeting. We lied to the A&R and company man's face, saying Andy had gotten sick with food poisoning and he was 100% reliable otherwise. Because again, it was still mega important to make good impressions and not make ourselves look unreliable. They ate it up, as the three of us were clearly really excited to be there, but the whole time I've got this heavy, anxious feeling in my chest thinking, where the actual freak is Andy? Everything went fine at the meeting, and we arranged to meet again less than a week later to sign all the actual contracts, at which point Andy really needed to be there. We felt like we dodged a bullet at first, and that it was simply a case of getting hold of Andy before A, finding out what had happened, and B, making sure he wasn't going to pull the same crap the following week when we needed to put pen to paper. So literally, the moment we got back to Sheffield, me and Andy the bassist thumbed down a black cab and asked the driver to take us to Andy the drummer's address. Andy was actually from Sheffield, so he lived with his mom and dad in a nice house near the Steel Bank. And then when we pulled up outside, Andy's car was in the driveway, so we assumed he was home. But when we knocked on the door and his mom answered, I recognized immediately that something was wrong. It was the look on her face, the one that says, I've got bad news to tell you, and since she knew us quite well at that point, she just told us, I think you two best come inside. Now, as we walked through the living room and Andy the drummer's mom asked if we wanted a cup of tea, all I could think was, oh my God, something happened and he's either dead or he's in hospital about to die. And so when she told me he was fine, at least in terms of his health, I felt this sort of premature feeling of relief. But that feeling disappeared entirely when Andy's mom explained that her son had been arrested. The first question out of our mouths was, what for? And looking back on it, I think his mom knew exactly why, and she just didn't have the heart to tell us. I don't blame her. I'd be horrified if my son was arrested on those kinds of charges, but the police always tell you why you're being arrested, don't they? So unless he was home alone when the police called around, there's no way his parents just didn't know why he'd been arrested. But like I said, I understand why she didn't tell us anything, and after we left, we had to kind of wade through the rumor mill before we found out what he'd actually been charged with. My first bet was drugs, because if Richie kept a secret habit, so could Andy. But it was so much worse than that, because Andy had been charged with both possession of indecent images of children and assault on a child under the age of 16. We found out when a news article was shared around Facebook with people either saying dirty nunts or, oh my God, I know this guy. Part of me believed it was all just some horrible mistake, but when Andy disconnected his phone, packed his bags, and just disappeared, we realized it was all true. The next thing we heard is that he'd pled guilty and received a very lengthy prison sentence due to aggravating circumstances. Apparently what he did to the kid that he met online was so bad, the judge gave him the maximum possible sentence. And then after that, he was gone. But so was the band, and so was our future. The record label didn't want anything to do with us after they found out what had happened to Andy, and the whole thing messed with Andy's head so much that he ended up getting mad into the drink for a while before he dropped off the map. Me and Andy the bassist tried putting a band together for a while, but the stink of what Andy the drummer had done was so bad that it followed us wherever we went. And in the end, I just sort of fell out of love with playing live music and jamming with other musicians. I still like playing guitar, it just became much more of a private thing before I swapped the guitar for a weight rack and started on my fitness journey. It became impossible to think about playing music without thinking about playing with my old band, and whenever I thought about playing with my old band, my mind would inevitably turn to what Andy the drummer had done, and more specifically, the kid he'd abused so horribly. I ended up trying to reach out to the victim and their family, but the courts are really strict on identities, so I didn't get the chance to, and maybe that's for the best. I just hope Andy didn't do too much psychological damage and that they've found a degree of happiness in their lives, because they're the reason I'm very careful about my own kids having access to the internet. Way back in the day, when I was still in my early 20s, I used to rent a bedsit in Croydon. Now, for you Americans listening, Croydon is a part of South London, and a bedsit is what we call a studio apartment. Now, basically just a bed, a kitchenette, and an attached bathroom, all in one room. Now, I found it after my mom kicked me out. Now, long story, we have a better relationship now, and I was really grateful to the landlord, a guy called Vic, who basically fast-tracked the whole application process so I could keep a roof over my head. Vic turned out to be a really chilled-out fella. He wasn't the kind of landlord to hold surprise inspections. He always got repairs and maintenance issues sorted as quickly as he could, and he was great about warning other tenants about loud music or late-night get-togethers. And so naturally I didn't mess about when it came to rent with him. I had it ready, all 400 quid of it, on the first day of every month, and me and Vic always had ourselves a little chat and a catch-up whenever he came over. Now this went on for nearly 5 years, and although it wasn't strictly the nicest place to live, West Croydon can be a bit rough, I was very happy there. I was able to patch things up with my mom, I had somewhere to take girls, and I had my freedom. And then one day, on the first of the month, Vic didn't show up to collect the rent. I got a bit worried about him because it was the first time in literally 5 years that he hadn't showed up to collect. At least the first time where he hadn't warned me in advance that collection would be late. Now, it wasn't exactly desperate to part with my rent money, I mean, who really is? But I liked Vic, and I was a bit worried about him, so I tried giving him a call. Now, his phone was busy the first time I tried, and then busy the second time too. And then when I tried about an hour later, I got one of those automated, "this person's phone is switched off" messages. The only thing I could think of at the time was that he'd been taken ill, seriously ill too by the looks of things, and that I'd have to just be patient and wait for him to show up and collect the rent. A few days later, I got a knock on my door from a guy claiming to be Vic's nephew, who's there to collect the rent. Now right away, I'm very suspicious. I've never seen this guy before in my life, and I still can't get Vic on the phone to confirm whether or not this was his nephew. Now I ended up telling the lad in the nicest way possible to just F off and not come back till he had proof that he was Vic's nephew. I was definitely in the mentality of this has to be a scam of some variety, but the guy claiming to be the nephew actually seemed to respect my position. And that had me questioning myself a bit, but I still thought that it was best to only hand cash over to Vic. And so I waited and waited, but Vic still didn't show up, and he still didn't return any of my calls. It wasn't until the first of the next month that I started to get worried again. I told myself Vic would be around with an explanation and to collect the 2 months' worth of rent that I owed him, but as you can probably guess, he didn't show up and he didn't call. And I expected another knock from his nephew, but that didn't come either. Now a whole 3rd month rolled around and I still hadn't paid anyone any rent. And then you guessed it, there was no sign of Vic or his nephew, who I now believe was legitimately his nephew. And then a few days later I got a knock on the door. I'm expecting it to be Vic or his quote-unquote nephew, but it was neither. It was a woman from the council, and she'd come to serve me an eviction notice. The only clue that she gave me was that she told me the property had been seized by the government, and since it was due to be sold at auction, I obviously had to leave. I asked her what was going on with Vic, but she said that she didn't know. All she knew was that the building was due to be seized to pay for money that he owed. At the time, I assumed Vic had been fiddling with his taxes or something. I paid him all the rent in cash, and so I'd assumed that he wasn't reporting all of his income, probably. And then when I got word about the seizure, I thought his luck had finally run out. But it wasn't taxes he owed, and while I had to wait quite a while to work out what had happened, it wasn't any less shocking for me when I found out. Basically, Vic had the outward appearance of a legitimate landlord, and I suppose to me, he was just that. But as it turns out, Vic had another tenant of sorts, one he didn't tell another living soul about outside of his immediate family. This tenant didn't pay any rent, but technically he didn't make any money either because Vic was using the guy for slave labor. Now, to cut a long story short, a young man had arrived in the UK illegally from Vietnam about 10 years prior. He heard about the flats that Vic was renting, but didn't have any money or papers to be able to move in, and while most landlords wouldn't be interested in entertaining someone like that and might point them in the direction of a homeless shelter, Vic did the opposite, but for reasons that were anything but charitable. As it happens, Vic wanted to get into growing weed in the basement of his house. It turns out a friend of his was involved in the drug trade and told him what a perfect spot his basement would be for growing some ganja. Now, his wife and grown-up son were fine with it, as it meant having loads of extra cash coming in. The only trouble was, none of them knew how to grow it. And so when he asked the Vietnamese fellow what skills he had, and the Viet guy said that he'd worked on a vegetable farm or something back home, Vic saw an opportunity. He enlisted the Vietnamese guy's help in converting his basement into what was basically a one-bedroom flat, with one portion of it dedicated to a living space and the other converted into a small-scale weed farm. Now, the Viet guy stayed in Vic's basement the whole time, and then once all the growing supplies were there, he was offered a job, or rather, a job that very quickly turned out to be no job at all. The Vietnam guy was told that if he stayed in the basement and grew weed for Vic, he'd be able to stay in the country. Vic would keep him safe and secret down there and would pay for all of his meals, etc. without charging any rent. He was free to explore the back garden so long as it was at night, but he obviously couldn't freely go walking about because the police would arrest him and send him back to Vietnam. Or at least, that's what the Vietnamese guy was told. Vic made out like he was doing the guy a favor, and that he'd sort him out with false documents and all that once he'd grown a few grand's worth of puff for him. But then once he'd sold his first crop and realized how much money he could make, he started lying to the Vietnamese guy and basically saying that he couldn't leave. Vic said the immigration people had been sniffing around. They hadn't, and that it wasn't safe for him to come out. He also said the Vietnamese guy owed him money for rent and food and energy bills and all of that, so he couldn't leave till he paid them off. It got to the point Vic would start locking the door to the basement and putting a bookcase in the way so nobody could see it. And so within just a few short months, that Vietnamese fella had gone from a legal immigrant to a modern-day slave. Apparently this went on for literally years, with conditions for the immigrant guy getting worse and worse, till one day, he snapped. Vic was in his 50s or 60s, and the Vietnamese guy was in his 20s by the time he escaped, so he easily overpowered him when Vic came down in the basement one day and then said he could either release him or die. And Vic chose not to die. The article I read online said the Vietnamese lad ended up getting picked up by the police for stealing a sandwich from Greg's. And then after he told his story, the police went to check if what he said was true, and that's when they found Vic's little grow operation. He hadn't even bothered to dismantle it, having most likely assumed that the Viet guy was too scared to talk to the police. But he was dead wrong about that, wasn't he? Because this Vietnamese lad was so pissed off that he'd been lied to and mistreated for so long that he sang like a canary once they got him down at the station. I suppose he was looking for revenge for what Vic did to him, and you can bet your arse he got it. Not only did Vic, his wife, and his son go to prison for a mix of drugs and modern slavery offenses, but the Vietnamese guy ended up getting tens of thousands of pounds in compensation, a lot of it generated from the sale of Vic's rental properties. Now, I'm not sure what happened to him after that, if he stayed in the UK or went home with his payout, because I imagine he could live like a king back in Vietnam with the exchange rate being what it is. Either way, I wish him all the best, but for me, the scariest thing is how Vic came across as this nice, laid-back fella, when in reality, he was probably the only person I ever met that I can comfortably describe as evil. A long time ago, almost 20 years in fact, a female friend set me up on a blind date with a guy named Ryan. He was a buddy of her boyfriend's, one he spoke very highly of, and for reference, I was a 28-year-old woman when we met, while he was almost a whole 10 years older at 37. My friend promised me that he was good-looking and that he had a good job, all that jazz. And while I hated the idea of a blind date and how it made me feel so incapable, I didn't regret going. Ryan was a truly beautiful man, but then once we got talking, I understood why he was single. First off, he sounded like a legit workaholic, and while he admitted that that was something he needed to work on, it leads me to the second thing, his poor communication skills. I called my girlfriend on my cell from the bathroom, and then she says, "Oh, he's just shy, let him warm up a little." And at the time, I thought that she was right. I was patient with him, told him he didn't have to worry about offending me or upsetting me. I mean, not within reason anyway. And then over the next month or two, Ryan really opened up to me. He didn't become some social butterfly overnight or anything. He was always kind of soft-spoken and reserved, but what I found out about him, I liked. He was super into ancient history, and I'm Greek on my mom's side, so I thought that was really cool. And then he was super into cooking too, which was really attractive for all the obvious reasons. But the thing, or rather place, that Ryan seemed to have the most passion for was the Philippines. And when I visited his place, I saw all kinds of photos, souvenirs, and traditional Filipino artwork. I asked him why he was so interested in the Philippines, and he said he'd vacationed there a bunch as a child, as well as an adult of his own volition. His grandpa served there during World War II, so he'd brought Ryan's dad over a bunch to see how beautiful it was. And from the pictures, it was clearly one of the prettiest places on Earth. There were pictures of Ryan standing on white sandy beaches in the company of various people, and then photos of him out in the jungle that he said were from nature tours. All the food looked amazing, the people all sounded super friendly and welcoming, and I totally understood why Ryan and his family had such a huge love of the place. The relationship went from strength to strength. I met his parents, he met mine, and we went on a wonderful weekend vacation together in Mexico around the 8-month mark. Now everything was going amazingly. And then just short of our 1-year anniversary, Ryan asked if I wanted to move in with him. I wasn't 100% sure at first because I've never lived with a boyfriend before and figured that was something couples only did after maybe 2 or 3 years of dating. But since I did really like him and he was everything I was looking for in a long-term partner in terms of cleanliness and having his crap together, I accepted and then moved in the following month. We spent our 1-year anniversary together in our apartment, and I know I keep saying this, but at the time, I was very, very happy. Ryan and I seemed like a really good fit for each other, and all of my girlfriends kept asking, "When's he going to pop the question?" I think if things had continued for maybe another year or two without incident, I'd have accepted any proposal he offered me. But, and as I guess you've already figured out from the way I'm talking about Ryan, things didn't stay all hunky-dory, and it wasn't long before things got really, really dark. Okay, so remember when I said Ryan was a workaholic? Well, he never really got a handle on that. He worked in the city at some financial firm, running accounts or whatever the hell they do in those kinds of jobs, and I understood why he took it so seriously and why he worked so hard. And then at the risk of sounding shallow, he wasn't shy about spending money on me, so I tried my best to make it up to him in various ways. And one of those ways was cleaning the apartment. Ryan really appreciated me keeping our place looking nice, and we didn't have much in the way of boundaries either, so there was only one place that he didn't want to mess with, and that was this one particular cabinet in the closet that he kept in his office. It wasn't some super sinister thing, with him getting all weird and telling me not to dare go prying around or whatever. He didn't even bring it up. It was me after I saw all the delicate little trinkets that he had in there. The first time I cleaned his office, when I opened the top left-hand cabinet on this big old mirrored closet type thing, I saw it was full of little wooden figures. They'd been carved to look like man and wife, wearing traditional clothing and holding traditional weaponry, and the carving was so intricate and fine that I was scared to break them. I asked him if he was cool with me not cleaning that part of the closet since I didn't want to break anything, and then when he said that was fine, I just moved on to other stuff. Now this happened maybe 6 or 7 times more, I can't remember exactly, as I'd given the apartment a deep clean about once every 2 weeks. And then one day, I opened up the little cabinet thing that houses those figures and found it pretty damn dusty. Those little figures, all coupled up like they were, looked kind of sad covered in so much dust. But still, I didn't want to risk breaking them, so instead of cleaning them off, I decided to just take them out of the little cabinet very carefully and give the inside of the cabinet a clean instead. And so at the very least, they had a nice place to live, even if Ryan was neglecting them directly. Now, I got the little footstool out of the bathroom and then took it into his office so I could get better access to the cabinet, which was just about arm's reach without it. I then took each set of figures, pair by pair, and set them carefully down on his desk before getting back on the footstool to dust the cabinet. I pushed the duster inside, and I was trying to get it all the way to the back when I suddenly felt the tip of the duster tapping against the rear wall. It felt pretty solid, so I figured that it wouldn't do any harm to really get in there, because I couldn't exactly scratch the wood with a duster, now could I? But when I did start trying to dust all the way to the back, I suddenly felt the rear of the wall give way. Now obviously I'm freaking out, thinking I just broke my boyfriend's cabinet, which was an antique passed down from his Austrian grandmother too, I think. And so my first thought was to go get my computer chair, bring it into Ryan's office, and then stand on it so I could maybe reach into the cabinet all the way and fix the part of the cabinet I broke. But when I did, I shined a little flashlight into the cabinet to see exactly what I was working with. I realized that I hadn't broke the back of the cabinet at all. It was a false wall, and behind it, there was a little wooden box. And now here's where I kind of get an existential crisis, right there in Ryan's office. I knew he was hiding something from me. I mean, there was a chance that he didn't know that stuff was there, but considering it had those familiar sort of Filipino designs carved into it, I considered that a highly unlikely scenario. And so the only logical explanation was he was hiding something from me. And now I knew it could have been pictures of old girlfriends, maybe even nudie pictures, and while I do think holding on to stuff like that is kind of obviously in bad taste, I totally understood that he had a past, just like I did. But then, if it wasn't souvenirs from old conquests, then it had to either be drugs, weird adult images, or worse. And I wasn't going to risk that being the case and me not knowing about it. Not in a million years. I removed the box from its little hidey hole, then set it down on Ryan's desk, and then saw it had a little padlock keeping it closed. One that was small, but very sturdy looking. I thought that was me out of luck, but just on a hunch, I checked the little hole for a key and, hey, presto, there was something shining at the back which fit the padlock. I took it off, opened up the box, and prepared myself to face whatever it was. But when I saw it, it was worse than anything I'd imagined. Far, far worse. When I first saw pictures of a grinning Ryan posing with naked children, you can imagine what my first thought was. I dropped the photo back inside, shut the box, and then found myself thinking, that's not what I saw, and you gotta make sure. Besides whatever kind of illegal activity was going on, it was going to the police in its photographic form, and so either way, I needed to open it up again and look inside. And so I did, and that's how I saw that they weren't being touched, or at least not in the photographs anyway, because the kids Ryan was posing with in the photos I was 90% certain were taken in the Philippines were dead. And I'm not talking dead like died in a disaster or something and Ryan was documenting it for evidence or something. I'm talking like they showed obvious signs of being violently murdered in various different ways. Slaughtered like animals, just like they do with pigs over on farms. I saw it once I was on vacation, how the pig's head was drenched in blood, and put two and two together before having sleepless nights with a lot of crying. Now, I'm sorry for telling you all of this. I guess I got a little too emotional there and I decided to take a quick break, but now I'm back to writing and I don't want to write about those photographs anymore. I can't think about them without crying. And so if it's okay with this submission, I'm going to focus on what I did after I'd put one of the photos in a book. I didn't have an envelope handy and I drove straight to the nearest police precinct to show them what I'd found. As you can imagine, that made for quite a scene. but I couldn't bring myself to walk inside for almost a full 15 minutes because I had a full-on mental breakdown while sitting in the parking lot and wondering how the hell I could have been so stupid. Ryan was not who he made himself out to be, obviously. Or at least he had a deep, dark secret that he really didn't want people to know about. And at the time, I told myself that there must have been 1,000 clues along the way that I just didn't pick up on because I'm a total freaking idiot. I don't see it quite the same way these days, but I still regret not cleaning that mother effing cabinet out sooner. And I also regret not biding my time a little and then going to the cops the next morning while Ryan was at work. That way they could have actually arrested him and not showed up to an empty house with his suitcase and a bunch of clothes missing. I think I must have driven over to the police precinct at maybe 4:20 to 4:30 p.m., meaning I was still crying in the parking lot when Ryan arrived home a half an hour later and realized his little box of keepsakes had been found. And then by the time the cops showed up, he was gone. And they couldn't exactly track his car down because he'd left it right there in the driveway. I was questioned extensively on where he might have gone to hide out or where he might have fled the country to. My answer was the same to both if I had to put my money on it. I'd have bet on him being in the Philippines. 6 times a week and twice on Sundays, as they say. And they never did find him. The cops, I mean, and I heard they even linked up with the cops over in the Philippines to try and track this Ryan down. I don't know if they could connect him to any actual murders, but if those photos really were what they appeared to be, then there must have been rumors or something. Either way, Ryan was never found. At least to my knowledge he wasn't, and my best guess is he's living someplace far away. Maybe not even in the Philippines, but definitely under an assumed identity.